For you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Lewis. I'm chairing this Business Incentive Study Committee. This is the last of our 4 meetings that we've had in different places around the state, with a whole goal in mind of looking at different aspects of businesses in Georgia and how we as policymakers can incentivize those businesses to do more, be more profitable, and make more investments in the state of Georgia. This is our last meeting, and we want to thank those here at Georgia Tech for opening up this facility for us so we can have this meeting here. And if any of you have an agenda, you've seen there's a list. You have seen there's a list of presenters, some this morning, mostly using PowerPoints, I believe, and then later this afternoon, maybe more testimonial. So I want to welcome all of you here. The focus of this business incentive meeting will be on energy and new technologies, and we have a number of presenters from Georgia Tech lined up to present some things to the committee, some new stuff that I'm excited to hear about. But we'll go right down the list. But before we get into the program, I'm going to introduce Betsy Jackson with Government Relations with Georgia Tech to welcome you here also. Betsy?
Good morning. We'd like to welcome you here to Georgia Tech. I have an introduction that I'd like to do, but I know that Dr. Webb has got another meeting, so I will turn this over to him for his presentation and his overview of SEI, and then I will welcome you after he is completed.
Good morning. My name is Roger Webb. I'm, as you see, interim director of the Georgia Tech Strategic Energy Institute. The inaugural director of that institute is Dr. Sam Sheldon, who's in the back, and who will talk to you later about some specific stuff. The Strategic Energy Institute was formed some time ago mainly to enhance Georgia Tech's contribution to the compelling issue of energy in our society. It's a compelling issue not only from the point of view of the technology, but also from the point of view of economics and just political stability. You got to figure out how to run this thing. Georgia Tech has had a long history of significant contributions in research in a variety of energy disciplines. Shown on the right is the rooftop of the natatorium, the swimming venue over across the way that was built to house swimming in the 96 Olympics. And as part of that, the roof was covered with photovoltaics, which were basically designed at Georgia Tech in our solar research laboratory. The whole roof was covered. It's still covered. It creates a significant amount of power and pumps it into the grid and partially into running the natatorium. In the nuclear energy arena, we have a substantial program in nuclear engineering and related programs in other disciplines that address the nuclear issues. That's a program that has been rather dormant in terms of student interest for some time, but as the energy needs become more obvious to everyone, that program is now growing again rapidly and is well populated by students, which bodes well for the future. We have at Georgia Tech a world-class combustion laboratory that has contributed a lot of technology to things like aircraft engines, but is now focusing on bringing some of those technologies to bear in gas combustion used for power plant operations. And again, a very significant operation at Georgia Tech. There's a thing called NETRAC at Georgia Tech. It's been around for about 10 years now. It kind of grew out of the research laboratories at Georgia Power Company. At some point, Georgia Power went out of that business. We acquired their facilities and about 15 of their personnel and created this National Electric Testing Laboratory, which is a significant contributor to research and development in the electric power distribution arena, and is a membership consortium that consists of about 30 public utilities, including, of course, Georgia Power, but utilities all across the nation, as well as the manufacturers of equipment that supply that industry. We have operations in fuel cells and hydrogen development. There's a fairly new activity in organic photonics, and those people are producing organic solar cells, which organic just means they're made from organic materials. The advantage of those things is that they're very cheap to make, and so that is a technology that's in its infancy, but has a lot of opportunities for the future. And then Georgia Tech has a leading position in the development of solid-state lighting. As you probably are aware, solid-state lighting is making a big impact in automotive lighting, in signage. It hasn't yet gotten to the point where it will replace these kinds of things that are illuminating this, just because the color of the light that is emitted by the solid-state lighting devices is not yet appropriate for use in venues like this. But there's a lot of research going on to make that happen. If that happens, there will be a substantial energy efficiency associated with replacement of incandescent fluorescent lights with solid-state lighting. The Strategic Energy Institute was formed more or less to focus the resources of Georgia Tech on the energy issues, to kind of coordinate the various activities that are already going on, to try to market those activities and get more funding for research, and in particular to bring that research to bear in the commercial sector by commercializing the research. And so the focus of the Strategic Energy Institute is just that. It's technology development, technology assessment, demonstration projects, and then hopefully commercialization of new technologies which will have a significant impact in the energy arena. Some of the things that have been going on that you may have read about, there's a study that is funded by the Southern Company to look at installation of wind turbines off the coast of Georgia to create electric power. That study is nearly complete. It remains to be seen whether the Southern Company will actually invest in deploying wind turbines in that arena. Hopefully that will at some point come to pass. There is a significant energy resource in terms of the winds offshore, and the work at Georgia Tech is aimed at trying to capture that and utilize it. So there is this wind project. There is a major project on creating ethanol out of southern pine, and I'm not going to speak much to that because Sam Shelton is going to describe that in much greater detail, but we feel that there is considerable potential in this endeavor. not only for creating fuels, but for creating favorable economic payback into the state of Georgia, where there is significant resources of southern pine presently underutilized. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Strategic Energy Institute is about. We're fostering contracts with major energy companies to further our research endeavors. The Chevron Texaco company has signed a contract with us for about $12 million to further our research, primarily in the area of biofuels, some other areas as well. We're working on similar contracts with many other companies. We feel that these contracts will enable us to develop technologies and deploy them and ultimately benefit the state of Georgia in terms of economic development. So that's about what I have to say about SEI. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to respond.
Thank you for that presentation. I got just a few questions, if you don't mind. And appreciate what y'all are doing here with the Energy Institute. You talked a little bit about wind energy, and I want to ask about that and one other subject, if you can go into a little detail on it. But when you put these wind mills or wind turbines up, as I think this is described, does the wind have to blow so hard, or so does the wind speed have to be a certain level in order to capture anything?
Well, certainly there has to be wind there, and it has to be to provide sufficient energy to turn the turbines and get something out of them, and then that doesn't happen all the time. So the people that study wind classify it according to a number, class 6, class 5, class 4, so on. That relates to kind of the average velocity of the wind. And to make wind turbines effective, you have to be in like class 4, class 5 winds. Class 6 look like hurricanes, and you probably don't want to be there. So the wind offshore at Georgia is class 4 kind of wind, and perhaps Sam can speak more eloquently to that later on. But the point is, you have to have the wind energy. Measurements have been made off Georgia's coast to ensure that wind energy is there. So beyond that, it's a matter of the economics of the installation. It costs a fair amount of money to mount turbines out in the ocean, and then you have to bring the power on shore, which is more expensive than if you were just operating on land. So there are economic factors.
Well, that was kind of my next question. I understand. I was going to ask you to describe the infrastructure of getting it from the turbines that are out there onto shore and into a grid somewhere where it can be used.
Well, conceptually that's reasonably simple. The wind turbine has an electric generator associated with it. It produces electric power, much like a turbine in a power plant. Then you have to bring that on shore. There's some technical factors about what voltage you use and so on, but you bring it on shore with undersea cable and bring it basically into an existing power substation.
You may have mentioned in your presentation, but is the Institute doing any research in coal gasification?
There's some work going on in gasification in general. We don't have a lot of exposure in the coal arena. We've got people looking at gasification of the byproducts of power pulp plants, and hopefully the ethanol plant that we will plan to facilitate later on. But there is expertise in gasification in general, but we've never had a lot of support from the coal industry.
Thank you. Appreciate that presentation.
Surely.
If you've just joined us, I'm Betsy Jackson from Georgia Tech Government Relations. We would like to welcome you here this morning. You'll be hearing from a variety of speakers on nanomedicine, energy, and then we will follow up this afternoon with a wrap-up on intellectual property and who actually owns the research and what Georgia Tech owns. If you are using a PowerPoint presentation, would you please see Lynn Durham, and she can help you set that up prior to presenting this afternoon. I just wanted to let you know that we are on a tight schedule. We do have professors that are going back to class, so we're trying to stick to the timetable. If anyone has any questions afterwards or would like additional information, my card is on the back table. If you'll take it with you, contact me, and I will get you in contact with the correct person. Thank you again for coming. And is Michael Pierce available?
I do not have a PowerPoint, so there's no rush to get that done right now. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Michael Pierce, and I'm with the Georgia Railroad Association. My name is Michael Pierce. I'm with the Georgia Northeastern Railroad, and I'm here with the Georgia Railroad Association. The Georgia Northeastern Railroad is based out of Marietta, Georgia, and we run to McKaysville, Georgia. I'm also with the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway, which is an excursion that operates from Blue Ridge, Georgia to McKaysville, Georgia. I'm here to speak to you today as the treasurer of the Georgia Railroad Association. The Georgia Railroad Association consists of 18 short lines and 2 Class 1 railroads, that being CSX and Norfolk Southern. We serve communities throughout the state of Georgia with approximately 5,000 miles of track. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak, to address the committee today, and ask for your consideration in a business incentive that we believe would lead to safer, more efficient, and more expansive rail network in the state of Georgia. Railroads play an important part of everyday life for Georgians, whether it be the cars you drive, the house you live in, or the appliances you use. Freight rail brings nearly 130 million tons of product to and through the state of Georgia yearly. In the future, there will even be more, the railroads will even play a more important role reducing the pollution and the traffic congestion. Every boxcar you see on the railroad means that there are 3 fewer trucks on the highways. Railroads are also critical to the state's economy. Their role should be increasing over the years. According to one study, even with moderate economic growth over the next 15 years, we will increase overall freight tonnage by 57% nationwide. An example of this would be recent projections from the Department of Energy that coal shipments will increase by 50% by the year 2025. Currently, 70% of all coal to the coal-burning power plants is transported by railroads. Currently, about 16% of the freight tonnage goes by rail. If that percentage does not increase substantially as freight shipments increase, Georgia and the nation will have a tremendous problem of pollution and traffic congestion on the Georgia highway systems. If the railroad are to meet the potential for our future economies, many improvements in the infrastructure will need to be made. Many of the tracks and bridges that short lines are currently operating on are inadequate to handle the new 286,000 and 315,000 pound rail cars that are now coming into service. As a matter of fact, a recent study from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials in their bottom line report says, if improvements are not made in the freight rail system, the nation's freight transportation system will weaken, and shippers, highway users, and communities will pay the social, economic, and environmental cost. As presented to you, enclosed is a press release showing that the railroads are one of the nation's most capital-intense businesses, investing an average of 17% of our revenues into the infrastructure, compared to 3.7% invested by the average U.S. manufacturers. But even with this record level of investment, we can't add infrastructure fast enough to maintain our long-term market share. and that includes investing well over $100 million by CSX, Norfolk Southern, and the short lines in the state of Georgia alone in 2005 for infrastructure and maintenance. It seems clear that encouraging the use of rail transportation would be in the public's interest. State tax equity is critical and necessary to the ability of the Georgia railroads to compete on a level playing field with the transportation modes. One needed change in public policy would be to eliminate the 4% sales tax that railroads pay on diesel fuel. Of this 4%, or of this 4 cents paid by our competitors, the trucking industry, 3 cents goes directly to the DOT highway infrastructure improvements. Basically, they're upkeeping their roads and bridges that they operate on. The 4 cents paid by the railroad industry goes to the general fund, of which the industry receives no direct benefit for rail infrastructure. The revenue impact to the state, by which we estimate to be about $14 million, pales in comparison to the nearly $482 million paid in wages to the over 8,000 freight rail employees. And with this previously mentioned high cost of capital required to operate our industry's vast rail network, these funds saved from an exception would go back to the infrastructure. As for taxes, it applies to our local states. 3 southern states do not charge sales tax for diesel fuel: North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. While the total exemption, we believe, is the most equitable way to address this issue, we understand that there are other alternatives that should be explored as well. Therefore, I'd submit 2 possibilities. The first one, a cap on the state's tax on a cent per gallon basis. A set amount per gallon would stabilize our projections, allowing us to more firmly establish infrastructure budgets. And the second would be the establishment of a dedicated rail freight maintenance program with the diesel fuel sales tax proceeds by which the railroad companies can apply for infrastructure projects. The state of Georgia, as you know, remains one among the fastest growing states in the nation. The people who currently live here and will live here in the future live in Georgia to rely day to day on the many products shipped over the Georgia's vast rail network. It will be vital to maintain this high capital-intense industry to effectively move these products. Thank you, and if there's any questions.
Committee members? I got one. On diesel, is that the primary fuel used to move your trains?
It is.
Okay.
That's what we...
There's no more coal-fired?
No, you can go ride the Great Smoky and see some coal.
Well, I was thinking. Is it the same grade of diesel fuel that's used in commercial trucks, or is it a different grade?
It's off-road grade. It's not the same as what we're using in the trucks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
Presentation. And you do have that to submit it for the record, I'm assuming? Your testimony? Okay.
Yes, I do. And I've got brochures for the Blue Ridge Scenic if anybody wants to go ride. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had, Michael, I just wanted to echo the Blue Ridge Scenic living up there and what that's meant to our community. Thank you very much.
Well, sure, it's really taken off, and we're very happy to have it. So, well, thank you very much for your time.
All right. I can introduce, if you'd like for me to. Is it Dr. Sam Shelton? Okay, Dr. Shelton, if you would make your way down. We'll hear a presentation from Dr. Shelton about southern pine to ethanol.
Thank you. I think you'll be able to hear me without the mic. It's a little easier for us all, I think. I would like to talk about the program that Roger Webb referred to briefly, and that is the Southern Pine Ethanol Program that we got started about a year and a half ago. And but the framework, the agenda, the items that I want to talk about is oil. Point out that oil is the U.S. energy problem. Talk about ethanol from cellulose, cellulose being wood-type biomass is the only near-term solution. Talk about Georgia's unused southern pine pulpwood, and then the program that we have to build a southern pine to ethanol plant here in Georgia. And then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. Oil consumption and oil production by the U.S. is shown here. We have 1900 here on the left. We have 2005 on the your right. And the vertical scale is the barrels a day, million barrels a day. This is our consumption trend, and you can see that it's steadily going up since the decline that we had in the 70s. That we could talk about why that was, but that's going to be probably impossible to duplicate. The more important thing I want to point out is the production. U.S. oil production peaked in 1970 when oil was $2 a barrel, and today, as we know, it's right at $60 a barrel, and we're producing 40% less oil in the U.S. than we did in 1970. It's not economics do not do not create more oil. It's a geological issue that you have oil peaking, and once you get the big reservoirs drained, then you have to find the smaller and smaller ones, and the rate that you can get out is declines. I want to make the point that oil is the issue that I think is the critical issue. We've got a lot of energy issues, but I think what you see in the press and what most of us get concerned about relates to oil. And sometimes I want to make this point because I think there's some confusion that is out there regarding what is the issue here. Oil demand is the issue. And that is transportation dominated. About the only thing else that oil is used for other than transportation is for the chemical itself. The chemical industry uses them to make plastics and those kinds of things. And those the oil molecules, so to speak, have a high value in that arena. And but the rest of it is all transportation. Electricity production uses no oil, and therefore nuclear power does not save us any oil and reduce our foreign oil dependence. Solar photovoltaics saves no oil, and wind energy saves no oil. Now, that's not to say that there are not a lot of motivating factors of why we want to do those three things. I just want to point out that becoming independent of foreign oil is not a motivating factor for any one of those three things. Economics and other things are, but saving oil is not, because we don't get any electricity from oil, and all of those things produce electricity. Ethanol directly saves oil because it mixes with gasoline and puts us in and reduces the amount of oil we have to have in order to produce that gasoline. Of course, our foreign oil dependence is a national security issue. Some of us old enough remember the oil embargo that we had in the 1970s when OPEC didn't like our foreign policy, and therefore they cut off our oil imports from OPEC, and that created lots of economic havoc and lots of disruption in our daily lives. The balance of payments issues, that's $200 billion a year. $200 billion a year goes overseas for oil, import oil. As one thing I believe is absolutely true, unfortunately, is that our current situation leaves no Iranian mullah or Saudi prince behind. It absolutely money goes directly in a large portion to countries that we are not very friendly with. And then, of course, the whole economics of what oil is costing and what gasoline is costing. I just want to point out, I'm just not going to spend any significant time on this, but I do want to just show it here quickly. This is the world global basis chart here. The bars show when oil was discovered, and the black line shows the production and consumption of oil. You notice that we, sometime around 1980, in the early 80s, we started using more oil than we were discovering. This is worldwide. And you notice that we had a peak discoveries back in the early 60s, and it has some peaks back in the late 40s. You find the big reservoirs first. If you randomly poke holes in the ground, you're going to find the big reservoirs before you find the small ones. But no geologist that is serious and has spent his life in that arena believes that curve is going to significantly turn around about oil discoveries. The cost of crude oil, of course, has tripled in the last, since 2002. There has been a recent decline, which is shown here. This is updated as of last week. It doesn't change the overall trend. There have been those kinds of pullbacks before. It's not anything that is unexpected, and don't know what it will go to. I have an opinion about what it'll go to, but that's another issue. So what do we do about oil demand? Well, it's a near-term problem from a national security issue, from an economic issue, from almost any issue you want to look at it. We need a solution to this problem in the next 5 to 10 years. We'd like to have it tomorrow, but you got to be realistic. Point is, if we only are working on solutions that are 20 to 30 years off, we'll never get to 20 or 30 years without some serious economic disruptions in our economy. Increase in auto fuel efficiency is one alternative, but it takes about 20 years to replace the vehicle fleet, even if Detroit started producing 100% of efficient vehicles today, which of course they can't, and that really is not an option, not if we're talking about 5 to 10 years. Ethanol from the forest industry is an option, a near-term option in the next 5 years or so. We mix with gasoline. All vehicles can burn up to 10% ethanol in mixture. There are flex fuel vehicles, about 5 million of them on the road, that can burn up to 85% ethanol or 100% gasoline. They're flexible fuel. The driver is all transparent to it. He doesn't need to do anything or know what's in the tank. The engine does. Wood biomass, agriculture industry is already there, particularly in the southeast, that's growing the biomass in the form of southern pine that can supply the resource. And we have the harvesting and transportation infrastructure to harvest that agricultural resource and get it to an ethanol plant. What is this program that we started and that we engage industry with? And of course, in these programs, we always engage industry. Georgia Tech is not going to commercialize anything or build a plant, but we always try to, in these programs, engage industry and with their money and with our contributing to the technology, jointly move the technology forward. The single objective of this particular program, now there are other programs and other projects on campus, like for instance, some of the ones that Chevron are funding are more what I would call basic science that will help the whole biomass to ethanol industry and technology. But this one is strictly funded by one company called C2 Biofuels, and is strictly to develop the technology to build an ethanol plant as soon as possible on a fast track. And there's also some matching money that has come from the Centers of Innovation out of Tifton that has been very helpful to this project. What are our resources? Our resources are the fact that we have about 18 million green tons of unused southern pine that's available per year that can be sustainably harvested every single year for the indefinite future. And, excuse me. So that is a resource that's available for ethanol production. The potential, that will produce about 750 million gallons of ethanol equivalent. And the direct value of that is about $1.5 billion of ethanol value in sales. This is just a flow chart, and I won't spend any time on it except to say you bring in the wood, you have a pre-treatment, enzyme, and hydrolysis and fermentation, separation for water and pure ethanol. The unique thing here separating it from corn is the fact that you have the lignin, the unconverted residues that you put into a boiler, produce steam and produce electricity, and that drives the whole system and actually put it in the grid. So it's very, very energy efficient. Unlike corn, where corn, to produce 1 unit of ethanol energy, it takes, you can argue this point, but this is a low number. I picked a low number so I don't get any argument on it. It takes about 70% of the energy you get out of ethanol as input in conventional fuels, oil, gas, and coal, in order to produce it. So you only end up with about a 30% net energy gain out of the ethanol. Whereas with cellulose, wood, you're talking about only about 10 to 15% of the ethanol energy values required in conventional energy input. So you get about 85 to 90% of the net energy value is produced from the biomass and not from conventional fuels. So we're looking at developing the pretreatment process, enzyme technology assessment, conceptual design of full-scale ethanol production facility, and the design and build a pilot plant. We are doing batch pretreatments here. We're doing them over in Sweden because they have some very nice laboratory equipment over there for pretreatment. And we're doing enzyme and fermentation treatment of the pre-treated wood here at Georgia Tech and at the University of Georgia. So in summary, Georgia has the technology and the resources to create pioneer ethanol industry. It's about $1.5 billion a year from the excess southern pine that is being grown. Excess southern pine is being grown that could be harvested on a sustainable basis if we don't plant 1 more acre of tree farms. So it's a regional issue. You know, so this is all over the Southeast that has this kind of potential. Just like the Midwest, corn is reaping the huge benefits from the corn ethanol industry. The Southeast can reap huge benefits from the pine ethanol industry. The environmental impact is carbon neutral from the global warming viewpoint, and the timing is right with oil above $40 a barrel, which is about where the economic break-even point looks like will be. We can capitalize on this opportunity. So thank you. Be glad to answer any questions.
I've got a question for you, Chairman, if I could. Well, could you elaborate on the success of the country of Brazil's ethanol process they're using down there right now?
Sure. They use sugar cane, and that is, I've followed that program since the 70s. They subsidized the heck out of it all through the 80s when oil prices were very low. It literally almost bankrupted the country. And the reason I say that is because sometimes it's put forth as an example how easy this is to do. It was not easy for them to get to where they are, where they're independent of imported oil. And that sugar cane, they've developed a huge sugar cane industry down there, expanded what they already had. Senator Chambliss is chair of the Agriculture Committee. Actually, his office sent me a study that was done by LSU. Louisiana has a sugarcane industry down there, and that study says that the economics really don't work up here in the States because of the growth issue.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman. Going back to the efficiency of the conversion, your 0.14 units to create one, that's the chemical process. Does that include transportation and harvest?
Includes everything. All the way from growing the trees, fertilizer, diesel fuel for the harvesting equipment, everything. By the way, most of it's in the processing. Very little in the rest of that.
On that same note with pines, you mentioned that these trees don't have to be tall timber type pines. How mature does a pine have to be before it can be used for that process?
So essentially what we're looking at initially is just the same thing that is fed to the paper plants and the pulpwood. So it's the same harvest cycle, 7 to 15 years. The reason we're doing that is for the consistency of the resource. It's a chemical process, and the consistency of the resource is very important in order to have an efficient and dependable process. And if you start throwing in different age and a lot of people talk about the wood waste and things, It can theoretically be done, but now you start having to modify your process depending on what resource you throw into the front end.
One last question from me. You mentioned there in your summary that oil reaching $40 a barrel is where it needs to be for this to be economically competitive. I read an article back in the summer, I think it was by Stephen Lieb, and he may not have been talking about the same type of biofuel, but I think he could have been. But he suggested in that article that oil would have to reach about $130 a barrel. Was that the same type? Are y'all talking about the same type of fuel? And if so, why is his estimation so much higher than what you have?
I thought I had read all of Stephen Lieb's books and things, so I have not seen his statement on that. So unfortunately, I can't comment on it. But we're not the only ones to say you can produce it for around $1 a gallon. National Renewable Energy Lab has studies that has shown that. Sweden has had studies that show that. So we're not out there by ourselves in our cost estimates about this $40 a barrel.
Any other questions from the committee? Go ahead.
What percentage of the total usage in Georgia would that $1.5 billion per year cover?
Good question. 15 to 20% of our gasoline usage.
Thank you, Dr. Shelton. Appreciate you coming and presenting that to us. Next to present to us is Dr. Ben Hill. All right. Please make your way up to the podium.
Let's see, if I could, do you mind if I unplug it? No. Okay. Excuse me just a minute. Hold that. There we go. Well, Mr. Chair and committee members, thank you very much for this opportunity to present to the committee. I'm Ben Hill. I represent Venture Lab and the Advanced Technology Development Center here at Georgia Tech. And we are involved in the commercialization of research out of the school, which then converts into business creation and job creation here in the state. So I'd like to talk to you today about a few things. One is to give you a little backdrop about some of the research going on here at Georgia Tech and the breadth and depth of some of the research. I think Dr. Webb has talked about that to a significant degree. Talk to you about the commercialization models here at Tech and what's kind of coming out of this process, and then speak to the renewable energy and clean tech marketplace, and then look at some public policy options. And I'll do my very, very best to stay on time. Okay, thanks. Just to kind of put things in perspective as to what's going on here at Georgia Tech and the scale of activity at Georgia Tech, as you've probably seen in U.S. News and World Reports, Georgia Tech consistently ranks in the top 10 in terms of engineering schools in the country. In terms of graduate schools, you can see where it is top 4. In terms of undergrad schools, it's a top 8 at school in terms of engineering. There's about $400 million of research going on at Tech these days, about 2,000 faculty and research staff on campus, 16,000 students, a lot of stuff. A lot of good stuff going on here. There are 4 National Science Foundation centers and 15 National Centers of Excellence, one of which is a National Center on Photovoltaics. So I kind of mentioned this to kind of give you a context that the activity at Tech is local, regional, and national, and in some respects international in scope. In terms of what comes out of the university in intellectual property, Tech is tied at 9th in terms of patents issued in 2005. And you can see from this chart that this is representative of an upward trend of intellectual property coming out of the school. At this point in time, this past fiscal year, about one patent disclosure was filed a day here at the school, that's pretty significant element. And out of this, a number of startups are formed and licenses are issued. This is a diagram of the commercialization model here. And let me kind of walk you through this to describe the role Venture Lab has and then how we hand off companies to the Advanced Technology Development Center, ATDC, which is the incubator on campus. In so many words, Venture Lab is between faculty research and the incubator, ATDC. And you have, like I described, you have this mix of all these students and faculty and all the activity comes through the Office of Technology Licensing, and I think Gilda Gardner will speak to some of the intellectual property activity on campus and OTL's role. Here in this center section is where Venture Lab comes to play. What the model that Venture Lab works with is evaluating the intellectual property to understand what market capability it has, what market merits it has, how you bring it to market, if there's value in creating a company, and then in addition, finding the management to launch the company and finding capital, both grant funds as well as debt and equity funds. Usually don't get much debt, but equity funds to launch an early stage company. And in the process, the technology is then licensed into the business and serves as a core foundation for the business, which then, these are early stage companies, which then moves into either ATDC or Intech Bio, which is a bio incubator on campus. Okay? So this is this process. What we do is in Venture Lab, my colleagues and I work with faculty in making sure the technology, one, is patentable and can be protected, but two, making sure there's a marketplace and a market need for technology. And I'll show you some examples of companies that have been formed out of Venture Lab in just a second. In terms of this personnel at Venture Lab, we've all come from industry. Some have been entrepreneurs, some have been venture capital investors. We've all had roles in startups and business development. So we kind of have a sense, an intuitive sense as well as trained sense for what a startup is and how to go about creating a company. Within Venture Lab, over the last 24 months or so, we've done a number of things to emerge in the field of renewable energy and clean technology. And clean technology is kind of an adjunct to renewable energy because it speaks to products and services that complement renewable energy. I think Sam just talked about C2 Biofuels, which is a company that's participating in the Venture Lab program that is bringing cellulosic ethanol to the marketplace based on yellow pine. We've just recently, this company, Y-Spy, is a fuel cell company that provides very small scale fuel cells that will go into sensors, integrated circuits, products that have extended shelf life. Think of a sensor that goes into a harsh environment where it's difficult to change batteries. That's the market context in which this product will and company will grow. Agitco is a company being formed by an eminent scholar on campus, Ajit Rohatgi, who is in the Solar Center. And his objective is to bring more efficient solar cells to the marketplace. Lumaflex is looking at a different angle on the photovoltaic market and looking at shifting the cost curve, reducing the basic material cost involved in photovoltaic cells. Vehicle monitoring technologies is involved in monitoring vehicle safety, and later on today you'll hear from Dr. Andy Gunsler about some of his research, and it's the basis for this company. And then last but not least is an interesting company, Climate Forecast Applications. These are folks in earth and atmospheric science who have developed some very sophisticated modeling capability, which allows them to predict with some reliability, better than 50% reliability, the probability of cyclones and hurricanes in certain areas of the world. So that has applications in energy trading, risk management, all sorts of markets like that. Just as a backdrop, the companies in Venture Lab, to this point in time, they're very small companies, but in total, of all the companies that have come through, about $43 million of venture capital and grant funds have been raised. There are 50 employees associated with these companies. Like I said, these are small companies. And then they move into ATDC, which is the actual tangible incubator where companies rent space and then grow into the marketplace. So these are some energy companies in ATDC. I think it's kind of, Dr. Shelton is giving kind of a backdrop on the energy context, but I think it's kind of interesting before I talk about incentives for early stage companies is the context in which a lot of these companies find themselves. The marketplace is massive in the United States, and this is, interestingly, this is a 2004 annual report which came out in August of 2006. So this is about almost as current information as you can get from the Energy Information Administration. But in 2004, our total consumption of energy in this country consisted of 6% renewable energy, kind of divided in this way. If you were to look at what's going on here in Georgia, and this is the latest number you could find for 2003. Here is our total energy consumption here in this state. Petroleum being the bulk, coal being second. Biomass is still interesting at 6%. A lot of cogeneration is going on there, and other, which was 0.4%, was for renewable energy in this state. Okay. So I mention that because those are some macro factors driving the marketplace. Insatiable demand for energy. The total energy market's growing around 3%. Some of those other segments are, in terms of renewables, are growing 20 to 30% per year. So what's this map all about? Well, thanks to Google and thanks to a creative entrepreneur, someone has mapped a number of clean technology companies across the state, or across the country, rather. And this represents, and I don't want us to be literal so much as metaphorical in looking at what this represents, both in terms of the geographic distribution of energy companies and clean tech companies. Also think about the political, the states in which these companies are based, and the dynamics both from a public policy perspective and a marketplace perspective. as to why these companies are where they are. The red dots indicate companies that have been placed on this map in the last 6 months. Okay. As you can see, there's a concentration of companies in the west, California, concentration of companies up east, from kind of like the Carolinas, Virginia on up. What a lot of these companies represent are renewable energies from ethanol, solar, things of that type. You can see a lot of ethanol businesses here in the Midwest, and interestingly, in the Northeast, New Jersey and Connecticut being 2 examples, a lot of solar companies have come to fruition over the last few years. Here in Atlanta, or in Georgia, there are 2 companies that are on this map. One is Convisco, which is a power energy management company that is a large business spun off of Scientific Atlanta and Lucent, and which has investors, international investors, and as well as national investors in California and New England investors in that company. And then the other company that's on this map is GE Wind. So, GE Power Systems is based in in Metro Atlanta. The interesting kind of sidebar to GE Wind is 4 years ago, GE bought, for $200 million, bought the assets from Enron Wind's business. Today, GE has a $2 billion wind energy business with a backlog substantial enough where if you were to order a wind turbine today, you couldn't get delivery for 2 years. The renewable marketplace for wind is just that strong. They're one of the top 2 competitors in the wind energy industry today. So I thought that would just give us a little bit of a context. I'd like to shift to public policy and what's going on in the public policy domain. You're probably very familiar with this, the Federal Energy Act of 2005, which was passed in August. Some of the components that are noteworthy for the companies I work with and developing companies are this in particular, a $7.5 billion minimum for cellulosic ethanol by 2012. Guess what? Probably in a couple of years, we're going to produce, we as a country are going to produce 7.5 billion gallons of gas by 2008. Loan guarantees for innovative technologies that avoid greenhouse gases, $50 million annually for biomass grants, tax breaks for energy conservation, and then this was an interesting point too. The federal fleet for those vehicles that are capable of using biodiesel, ethanol, biofuels, they have to be operated on those fuels exclusively. So we're going to go down to Fort Benning, and there is a substantial amount of the fleet at Fort Benning and other installations that use biodiesel today. So I kind of want to mention that, and then ask this question: so why do we need to provide incentives for Georgia? What's the rationale for it? It's accelerate marketplace development. There is a marketplace. It's nascent. It's pretty early stage. Can we do something to accelerate the uptake and the growth of these markets? Be competitive with other states. I'll show you a couple of slides in a second where you can see what other southeastern states are doing. Increase business job growth and retention, because I think in some cases businesses have to go where the marketplace is, and if the marketplace is somewhere else, sometimes businesses unfortunately relocate. And then at the same time, if the marketplace is here, businesses will relocate here. We've seen that happen. And then reduce energy dependence. Here's a comparison of renewable energy programs across the southeast. And I'm sorry for the small print. Tried to get this one all on one slide. So here we are relative to, other states in the southeast. Here we are, here's Texas, which I think is kind of interesting to note. How Texas has addressed the issues, and then here is what's going on at the national level. Just as an interesting point about Texas, about a year ago I heard a member of the Public Service Commission of Texas speak at a conference, and he said, in Texas, for a long time, they were energy exporters to the United States, to the other states. They found themselves being, in the mid-90s, found themselves being an energy importer as a state. And that just didn't square with what Texas is about. And they spent a lot of time thinking about it and said, as a state, Texas needs to be an energy exporter. So they kind of made a mental sea change there and have done some things, like you can see what their 5 stars across here, about how Texas has begun to engage creating an infrastructure of renewable energy. Today, Texas, interestingly, is one of the top 2 wind power producing states in the country. Just a little fact. So you can see how Georgia compares, from a net metering perspective. Here, this is the notion of selling power to the grid on a peak basis, so that someone who has a renewable energy source can use that source to sell power back to the grid and make some revenues off of it. There's green pricing, where there's green energy is available. Renewable energy credits are tracked in some states. And then here, Texas has a renewable portfolio standard, which says that a certain percent of the power sold to the grid has to come from renewable sources. North Carolina has a public a committee of the General Assembly is looking at renewable portfolio standards. Virginia is out for public comment, and Florida has renewable portfolio standards to some degree. Okay. And then from an incentive perspective, too, what's going on from the fuel side of things? And Florida, Mississippi, and North Carolina have and Texas have mandates and incentives for fuel. In Texas, 5 million gallons of alternative fuel were used last year in the state fleets. In North Carolina, you can get a 35% tax credit for construction of an ethanol or biodiesel plant. In Mississippi, you get 20 cents per gallon direct cash incentive. You get money back from the state to produce ethanol in Mississippi. And in Florida, there is even a 75% credit allowed for capital goods for or infrastructure for ethanol and biodiesel production. So those are the things that are going on there. And just so if I were to make some recommendations, or we were to make some recommendations, number one, and I'm sorry I'm running out of time here, number one is the R&D tax credit as an overarching umbrella, independent of industry, is it possible to decouple the state R&D tax credit from the federal tax credit. Have the state tax credit be standalone, and because what has happened is the Georgia tax credit is contingent upon the federal tax credit. And when the feds do or don't pass, then the Georgia R&D tax credit comes into play. In some cases, the feds have been slow, the Congress has been slow to pass a tax credit. So this state, if you're an entrepreneur or a business in the state, you don't benefit from the R&D tax credit. The Georgia Research Alliance is proposing several improvements to R&D tax credits, and there's a white paper which they've developed, and I can get you further information about that if you're interested. And then specifics to the energy market development. What about the idea of having a renewable fuel standard for the state analogous to what's part of the energy bill, where state vehicles are required to use 10% biodiesel or 10% ethanol in the fleet? What about the idea of establishing a minimum amount of renewable energy to be consumed in the state, similar to what's happening, the discussion in North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida. Then, as I mentioned, those tax credits, what if we were to provide specific incentives for construction of biofuel facilities or renewable energy facilities? And then, last but not least, is effectively kind of drilling down and making sure, like, the net metering program is fully implemented, where there are uniform standards where you or I can sell our energy back to the grid easier than we can today, okay? Some of the, just bring your attention to the Georgia Energy Plan. Some of these components are in the Georgia Energy Plan, but there are some other components to be considered there as well. So I'm sorry I've run out of time, but I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Sure. I appreciate your presentation on energy, but given that Business Incentive Study Committee is what we're doing, I would rather, have seen the white paper on your suggestions of what those business incentives. So my question, I guess, or comment is, again, great presentation, but follow that up with business incentive. That's what we're here for.
Sure.
What we can do to incentivize business in Georgia, improvements to the R&D tax credit. I'm most interested in. We do here, try to stay standard with the feds a lot with our tax code, is what we've heard in Chairman O'Neill's Comprehensive Tax Reform Committee. So it'd be real interesting to see what that white paper says.
Okay. I'll be happy to get the GRA.
Yeah, I too would like to echo that. We would like to see that information you have on that top priority up there. That really goes to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish here as this study committee. And also the second from the bottom, the incentives for Georgia energy producers. I think I heard you specifically mention renewable energies, which that needs to be in there. And we were able to pass a tax incentive this past session that would help biomass in electrical production. But if that would also include incentives for traditional energy producers as well. If you have any information on that, we would like to, if you would turn that into us. Also, that the top and the second to the last there would be great. It would go right to the heart of what we hope to accomplish here.
Glad to.
All righty. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for presenting. Appreciate it. Next is, I'm going to mess up the last name, I'm sure. I'm just going to call you Dr. Mark for now. And when you get up here, you can pronounce your last name correctly.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this group and give some thoughts about pharmaceutical innovations that are going on here at Georgia Tech and in the state of Georgia, and how these innovations can lead to new business opportunities and economic growth for the state. I'll be presenting my comments largely in the context of a case study from the Laboratory of Drug Delivery, so an aspect of pharmaceuticals, namely better ways to administer drugs into the body. And my name is Mark Prausnitz. I'm in the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering here at Tech. So let me start with, in a sense, the bottom line. Pharmaceuticals are the highest value-added industry in America. U.S. sales exceed $150 billion a year. The growth rate in the U.S. is 6%, and the profit-to-revenue ratio is almost 19%, which is the highest of any industry in the country. So pharmaceuticals, from a business perspective, not to mention a health perspective, are extremely important to the state and to the country. So with this motivation to pursue pharmaceuticals, I'll give some overview of some research that is going on that I think can lead to some innovations, as well as a couple of commercialization case studies. And finally, a few comments about the Center for Drug Design, Development, and Delivery, which is seeking not only to make innovations, but to move those innovations into the marketplace. We all know that injection of drugs is not ideal, but sometimes that is what is needed. You need your flu vaccine, you've got to have a shot. You need, if you're diabetic, you need your insulin, you've got to have a shot. But maybe there is a better way, and one way that some people feel is better would be in the form of a transdermal patch, like the nicotine patch and the few others that are out there. So a question that we have been wrestling with is, how can we take the concept of the patch, easy to use, people like it, and people therefore will take their meds, but at the same time have the efficacy, the effectiveness of an injection with a needle. The approach that we've taken has been inspired by a little closer look at the skin. And what I'm showing here is a slice through the skin. At the very surface is a thin layer called stratum corneum. And in fact, if you touch the top of your skin, what you're feeling on the top there is this thin layer of stratum corneum. It's thinner than the width of a hair, but if you perhaps compare the difference between the feel of, say, the inside of your mouth to the surface of your skin, they feel very different. The main difference is that very thin layer called stratum corneum. Well, that very thin layer has some amazing properties, which is it doesn't let things in. And that's usually good. You don't want to spill things on your body and have them be absorbed. But if you want to put drugs into the body, it's a real problem. Well, an approach you might take, and one that we have taken, is using something called microneedles. We've used the technology of the microelectronics industry, and instead of making tiny transistors, we make tiny needles. Because the real barrier to the skin is just this very thin layer, small needles can work. Small needles can cross that barrier and get a drug into the body. And you don't need to use a big hypodermic needle in many scenarios to inject deeper. You just need to make a very shallow injection. So this is the basic concept. We've been working on this for about 10 years, and here are some pictures of various kinds of needles that we have made. They're different materials, so silicon, we've etched those into a silicon wafer, much like what is done in microelectronics industry, but we've also made them out of stainless steel, out of a polymer or plastic material. These are all solid needles. We've also made them hollow, again, out of metal, and you can get some sense of the size. In the lower right, you can see a typical hypodermic needle tip, and the height of these microneedles is similar to the width of a hypodermic needle. There's another picture with this penny. You can't even make out all the needles, but in that small space, the gray spot there are 400 microneedles. So you perhaps get the sense they're very small, but nonetheless should be effective to deliver drugs. And I won't give you all the data to support that. Hopefully you'll take my word that this is something that's useful, but it's proceeded to the point where we're doing clinical studies at Emory University with physicians delivering insulin, delivering pain medication, and so forth. Now, based on this technology, we sought to commercialize it. And I wanted to give some insight into how this worked for us as a representative of how this kind of process works at Georgia Tech and perhaps at other institutions in Georgia. So back in 1994, I came for an interview to see if I could get a job here. And during that interview, I met with a professor who was already here at that time named Mark Allen. And I had this idea about the microneedles. My area is in drug delivery. His area is in the microelectronics and microfabrication. I said, can you make small needles? And he said, sure, come to Georgia Tech and we'll do it. So I did. And I arrived the next year. We started a graduate student. A couple of years later, we published a paper on it, which garnered some publicity, which actually was quite important. Georgia Tech did an excellent job of publicizing this technology, which led not only to great scientific opportunities, all sorts of colleagues became aware of this and we had good scientific discussions, but also was very important from the business perspective, where I had lots of companies. In fact, just this morning I spoke with a company in Britain that's interested in using this technology in an aesthetic context, not in a medical one. So the publicity arm of Georgia Tech has, I think, done a tremendous job to foster the communication to the business world. Well, this led to forming a company, Mark Allen, myself, and a third person with business expertise. The technology was licensed from Georgia Tech to the company. A memorandum of understanding was signed to monitor that process and make sure all ethical considerations were handled appropriately. And very importantly, the Advanced Technology Development Corporation, or Center, ATDC, was able to provide some seed funding to get this project going, and that made a critical difference for us. And so I'll give a plug for this and other similar kinds of programs that exist to provide seed funding to move the technology out of the laboratory, get a company started, and turn it into a reality that helps people and helps the economy. Well, what has happened since then, the company, after a first financing round, was in turn sold to another company called BioValve, and just in the last few months, BioValve has announced a reverse merger that they've undergone, and the expectation is that within the first half of 2007, that will ultimately lead to a listing on NASDAQ, and the technology is really maturing and, again, finds its base here at Georgia Tech, here in the state of Georgia. I'll also mention that things that are ongoing is to try to take this technology and launch a vaccine initiative, particularly targeted at the developing world, where it's a critical problem of needle reuse and not enough money to pay for needles, and therefore they get reused, and a million people die a year due to illness contracted by reused dirty needles. So if we could perhaps use this microneedle platform, needles that can't be reused, we could get rid of that problem, as well as a number of other advantages as well. So it's still an active effort, and maybe if we have the chance to meet in a few years, I can report on some successes with that. Well, there are a number of different technologies that are being developed and being pursued towards commercialization, and I've mentioned the microneedles concept, very small needles that then poke into the skin. I'll briefly go through some other ones. Thermal ablation is the name that I've given this. Basically, you make some microscopic heaters get hot for a tiny fraction of a second. And the result is that they blast out microscopic holes in the skin, and now the drug can go in through those holes. And there's indeed a company here in Tucker that is called Altea, and they are working on this technology as well and are in clinical trials with it. Another possibility is something called jet injection that we're working on. This has been around for a while, but we're trying to make it better, where you shoot little liquid droplets of your drug, shoot them at the skin so fast that they burrow into the skin like little bullets, and you don't have to use a needle in the process. Another approach uses microdermabrasion, and perhaps if there are any of those in the audience who are concerned about their wrinkles, maybe they've gone to see a doctor to have this procedure done on the face or elsewhere to make the wrinkles go away. In essence, what microdermabrasion is micro-sand blasting of the skin. It's scraping off the upper layers of the skin, and that makes you look more beautiful. But in addition, you could scrape off the upper layers of the skin and deliver some drugs. So we're looking at that by scraping open some microscopic holes, and this is in collaboration with Emory University's Vaccine Center to deliver their HIV vaccine. Meganins are a kind of protein. It's a molecule that you can find on the skin of an African claw-toed frog. It's a natural antibiotic for that. Keeps the bacteria away, keeps the frog safe. But it turns out you can use this kind of a molecule in a different sort of way, and it can make some holes in the skin. Instead of making holes in the bacteria, which is what it does in nature, it puts some holes in the skin, and you can send drugs in. And so we're looking at that. And the last topic is high-throughput screening as a way to consider lots of different chemical approaches to delivering things to the skin and finding those rare ones that work especially well. I'll pick up on just one of these and mention its commercialization stage. It's not quite as far along as the microneedles. In 2004, we invented this new drug delivery technology, filed a patent application, and turned to a different place, in this case not ATDC, but MTech Bio, this Emory Georgia Tech collaboration to facilitate commercialization of university technologies, and received funding from them, which again was critically important to moving this along, and we're now in the second year of that funding. We've had discussions with the first company to fund and license this, and as it turned out, we failed to reach agreement on intellectual property terms, and things fell through with that company. And that's also a consideration that we often have to deal with. We want to not only optimize for making commercialization happen quickly and immediately, but we need to have the longer-term perspective and protect the intellectual property interests as well. Well, fortunately, just after that fell through, we started talks with another company, and this was a big player in the field, Tycho Healthcare, and indeed discussions went well. We have in turn filed a patent, received that funding, but the more important point is that Tycho Healthcare has now licensed the intellectual property, is continuing to fund it, and the expectation is that this relationship will continue, and ultimately the technology will be commercialized for drug and vaccine delivery. I've highlighted two examples of industrial interactions and commercialization efforts that exist in my laboratory, but there are a number of companies that we interact with, and I'll list them here. I won't talk about them all, but I'll mention, for example, Cytodome. This is a company that existed outside the state of Georgia, but decided to move here based in part on funding that came through the state, as well as the opportunity to interact with our laboratory through the use of ultrasound to deliver drugs more effectively. And a number of other companies here, both in-state and out-of-state, that we are interacting with in various contexts, and in some cases have received incentive funding through the state. Taking a bigger picture of commercialization, tech transfer, and innovation at Georgia Tech, here are a few statistics from the previous fiscal year. Georgia Tech, you can see the number of invention disclosures, patent applications, issued patents, and so forth. And these numbers are in the top 10 in the United States for the number of patents at an academic institution. Some other numbers in terms then of licensing that intellectual property, licensed invention, software, startups formed, tech transfer income, and this puts Georgia Tech in the top 5 in the United States for startup companies, and in an overall aggregate evaluation done in this case, Georgia Tech was put in the top 10 overall for technology transfer. So it's a very fertile place to be. It's not only a place where there can be innovations, but a place where the university and the state are able to move those innovations forward in a tech transfer process. Well, I'll end with just a few comments about a particular location, the Center for Drug Design, Development, and Delivery, so different aspects of pharmaceuticals. It's a center that exists here at Georgia Tech, although there are some close alliances with Emory University, in particular the vaccine center there, as well as alliances with Mercer's pharmacy program. And this center is an interdisciplinary group of faculty from sciences, from engineering, from various disciplines who work together on pharmaceutical research and education. The center seeks to facilitate innovative research, particularly at the interface of engineering and bioscience, which is one of our particular strengths at Georgia Tech. Student training is an important component of this. Not only do we want students to be able to carry out research and make innovations, but we want to train them so that they can enter the workforce, enter companies, and be effective to move this and other technologies forward to advance healthcare. And finally, the center has an active activity to encourage impact on the pharmaceutical industry. And in fact, I was just last week for a few days in Puerto Rico. As you may know, by far the dominant industry in Puerto Rico is pharmaceuticals. About 2/3 of their economy is pharmaceuticals. And we are seeking to set up alliances with the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico for a variety of benefits, both educational, research, and otherwise. But there are some really significant efforts going on here on campus to advance pharmaceuticals. And the last slide just gives some names. Maybe you know one or two of them, maybe not, of faculty here at Georgia Tech who are all involved in this effort of CD4, this pharmaceutical research effort. I'll just end with a general comment that hopefully I've given you some perspective on some very focused examples of activities going on here at Georgia Tech, in my laboratory and otherwise, where there's an environment at the university and in the state to very much foster innovation in research, but explicitly to leverage that through a variety of programs offered largely with state monies, to move that technology out of the university into companies, into commercialization to benefit society and the economy. Thank you very much.
Not specifically with your research, but in the last couple of years, there have been articles published about nasal inhalers, but yet you don't see as much of that lately. I wonder what happened.
Probably the best known nasal method of delivery is there is a flu vaccine that is given via the nose and has had some success. Of course, if you have a stuffy nose, you might deliver things that way. But you're quite right that it's very limited. The problem with the nose is that, of course, there are other things in there that sometimes you want to sneeze out, and they get in the way. It's not really a stable environment. So you spray something in, and it may drip out. You may sneeze it out. It may not go where exactly you want it to go, depending on how stuffy your nose might be. So it's a hard place to work with. It's also, some are bigger, some are smaller, but the nose is a relatively small region, unlike the gastrointestinal tract, for example, or the skin, very large surface area. So you have a relatively small area to work with. So I think those are some of the reasons why that has not progressed the way some of the other methods of delivery have.
Thank you. Appreciate that presentation. Next, again, I'm going to not pronounce the last name. I'm just going to say Randy, Dr. Randy. Make your way. You can correct us when you get up there. I won't butcher your name up.
See if this goes. Okay. My name is Dr. Randy Gensler. I'm a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I'm involved with a company called Vehicle Monitoring Technologies. That's a venture lab startup company. I'm trying to get it on both screens. I'm not sure if that's going to work. There we go. Okay. And I'm here to talk today about vehicle and driver monitoring in public and private fleets. We're in the middle of a commercialization process right now with what's called the Tiger Team, which is a National Science Foundation sponsored review of essentially our business plan. That NSF team includes 2 PhD students in the School of Business, 3 MBAs, and 3 Emory third-year law students who are reviewing the intellectual property that we're putting forward into this venture. VMT, like I said, is a venture lab startup company. There's a GTRC ownership interest. Georgia Tech researchers are currently the company principals, and then as the business plan evolves, it turns over into pretty much exclusively private industry. We're the exclusive licensee of the vehicle data collection and processing technologies that we developed as part of a $2.6 million research program, which was developed through federal and state money and also with Georgia Tech's involvement. We have one patent application, full patent application that's been submitted, 1 provisional patent that's in, and 3 more provisionals that are on their way. We have extensive experience in basically the development of hardware, development of data monitoring systems. We run a data center, and then in detailed analysis associated with, really with risk with driving. And the patent application that we have in that's being reviewed right now is on real-time revealed risk insurance pricing. And it may sound a little strange to think that as you're driving, you could be paying a cent per mile insurance rate as a function of where, when, how, and under what conditions you're driving. But the reality is that the current insurance industry, the current structure of the insurance industry, where we have pooled risk, where you as a driver are lumped in with others of the same demographic group, ticket histories, zip code where you live, and whether or not you commute to work, there's a wide spectrum of risk in that category. You may be in the middle, you may be at the high end, you may be at the low end. And if you look at just from a business perspective, if the pricing is priced more proportionally to the actual risk of the drivers that are in the group, we're going to get not only more efficient collection of revenues, and will reduce payments out overall, but in addition, if the driver can get a signal as to how risky their driving is, hopefully we can change travel behavior through that, or at least driver behavior. We have a couple of PhD dissertations that are coming out. The data that I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes, it's about 1.6 million vehicle trips that we've monitored on a second-by-second basis. And in looking at those drivers who were involved in crashes versus those drivers who are not involved in crashes, excuse me. Okay. What we have found is that the typical indicators of gender and age group are not really the primary indicators of risk. It's really the aggressiveness of the driving, the speed and acceleration profiles, the speed versus speed limit, overspeed, and where you drive. In fact, driving on roadways where there are a lot of crashes associated with roadway design is another important factor. The data collection project that we've run over the last 3 years has collected information from 1.6 million vehicle trips in the Atlanta metro area, predominantly in the 13-county area. We've monitored more than 1 billion vehicle seconds of data, and we manage a data center of about 2.2 terabytes of information. We have developed a lot of automated data processing and report generation techniques. We have websites that are interactive so that you can review the trips that you've made, look at those histories. And in the last final phase of the deployment, we'll actually be doing online travel diary surveys for the first time that we know of in history. We coordinate a lot of different survey mechanisms with this and field tested our equipment in goods movement and transit applications. This is the location of the households that participated in the study. We had about 275 households representative of the Atlanta area by income, household size, and vehicle ownership, with the exception of the low-income group, which we had a higher opt-out rate over time. They tend to be more mobile than the upper-income groups, which actually had a higher opt-in rate than we expected. The equipment that we developed for the deployment is essentially a 386 computer with the capability of bringing in global positioning, system information, onboard diagnostics, and the like. The next generation of hardware is actually a modular system that operates on the GPRS GSM cellular channel, which is essentially the T-Mobile singular channel that's out there right now. The equipment allows us to bring in real time. The deployment we have out right now is we upload the data once a week, but the new equipment allows us to bring in data in real time, origin, destination, route, distance, time, speed, up to 10 engine parameters at a time. We typically collect 7 to 10. Get everything on a second-by-second basis, upload all of this by cell phone, off-peak currently, real time on the prototypes we have in place. We do routine data integrity checks. So essentially we've got a really functional working system that allows us to collect and aggregate and manage all of this information together. Surprisingly, the equipment is quite accurate. 95% of the data fall within about 15 feet of your actual roadway location, which brings up a lot of privacy issues. I won't talk about that right here, but we've got a lot of things that we've done to protect privacy, including we've had to obtain a certificate of confidentiality from the National Institutes of Health. So full reviews and full protection of privacy of the participants in this study. For commercial applications, commercial contract, essentially employer fiduciary duty to employee or employee to employer governs a lot of this. But when it comes to private insurance applications, there are some still significant outstanding questions about privacy and data ownership. We have an in-vehicle data terminal that allows us to indicate what the current road price is. In addition, you can look at speed versus speed limit. I've had this one in my vehicle for about 3 months, and it works wonderfully. In addition, we can do interactive surveys of the drivers at the end of any trip. I'm going to skip through this. Essentially, we have a new system that's coming out which has GSM, GPRS, real-time data transfer. We have the capability of integrating cellular voice and E911 service. We can bring in Bluetooth and Internet, accelerometer modules for crash detection. We've done deployments of 200 vehicles with crash monitoring, dashboard terminal for driver messaging. We have the last item here, USB 2 cameras for communications and communications hardware for an application that we're looking at in one of the states north of here. skip through the architecture. We manage very large data sets. Like I said, 2.2 terabytes of data, and it gives us the ability to really look at everything in detail. Because every second of vehicle operation is mapped to the driver, the vehicle, and the roadway characteristics, the roadway design characteristics, road grade, curvature, the crash histories. We really get a rich data set for data mining. And in addition, the data structures are amenable for creating any kind of summary charts, tables, and text reports that we want. And I'll just breeze through at the end some examples of the kinds of reporting that we do. Now, our core business plan is not really in the hardware side. It's in the data management, data analysis side. Integrated driver vehicle data communications, safety and security monitoring, and then management of the information rather than management of the fleets themselves. We have 2 partners right now that are looking at major deployments of 10,000 units and 5,000 units, through which we would help them in developing their final hardware specifications. They would do all of the deployment, and we would do all of the data management and data analysis. And then with the license agreements through Venture Labs, they would eventually take over the activities that we have, and the core business plan calls for essentially the collection of those royalties over time. Analytic services, driver training, advanced statistical spatial data analysis, software development, business services. There's really, when you have the data, it's amazing how much you can do with it. Now, in terms of customer costs, the proposed comprehensive fleet monitoring, which would include at the high end camera data and at the low end, obviously no camera data, it's really service dependent, is really kind of a cradle to grave cost for a 5-year deployment. And what we've done in terms of the fleet applications is we've done the calculations of return on investment for not only private fleets but also for government fleets. And what we found with the government fleets is that we can give a 30% return on investment coming back for monitoring of those government fleets. Reduced use of private vehicles or public vehicles for private use, reduced crash frequency, increased employee productivity, improved safety and security. And believe it or not, the rich data set that we get from the instrumented vehicles comes close to replacing a lot of the camera-based systems that we currently use for looking at traffic flow in the region. Not the cameras that we use to identify where crashes occur, but the computerized camera systems that we use to determine when we have recurrent and non-recurrent congestion. So in summary, we've developed, through the Georgia Tech Research Corporation and through Venture Labs, a company that has basically taken the intellectual property and is looking at licensing that intellectual property to other companies that are going to be deploying in the field. We would look at our business end as basically providing the service center. The technologies we have in the field are field proven. They've been running for 3 years, and that's on a 386 platform. And we have the new designs for the enhanced system that we can deploy within 6 months of getting a major contract. We have extensive experience in managing the field deployments, and one of the big things we bring to the table in terms of the business end is the automation capability. And that is, we do a lot of programming so that we only have to go through the data one time to develop a system of applications that we can then use for a variety of commercial and government purposes. Here's just some examples of report generation that we can do. Is this a laser pointer? Yeah, okay. We look at activity monitoring. This is for a commute vehicle that comes from the north of town in on a routine basis. Here's a commute vehicle from the south. This is a van that's more of a served passenger at home during the afternoons vehicle. And this is a retired couple that lives over here. So we get really good information on where and when people are traveling in the Atlanta metro area. We can do speed versus speed limit and bring that into safety report cards. Here's speeding, braking, seat belts, et cetera, can be provided. We do a lot of geofencing so we can detect when areas are entered, for example, for deliveries or to look at places where people are not supposed to be. Here's an example of vehicle activity analysis. This is for my vehicle. You got a home location, 2 major business locations here and here for work. This is actually not a customer. This is where we go for health care, preschool drop-off, regular school drop-off, shopping. So you can see that the trip patterns for households or for businesses pop out quite readily out of these activities. This is speed versus speed limit, looking at overspeed. And here's, for example, on the safety side, these are 3 female drivers in our study. One is age 19, single. One is age 30, single. One is age 59, married. They're all driving sedans. And this is the 70 mile per hour marker right here. These are 5 mile per hour bins. And so you can see that there's distinctly different driver characteristics associated with how these vehicles are being driven. We notice that this changes over time. It changes in context of where and when you're driving, rural roads, for example, versus urban roads. And using these kinds of data mining techniques, we can actually get a pretty good handle on risk. So we believe that the applications in the insurance industry are going to be pretty significant. This is vehicle acceleration versus speed. And you can see these high speed events and these hard braking events and these hard acceleration events, which indicate aggressive driving, also turn out to be very important in terms of assessing risk. And here's, for example, seatbelt use by trip. You can see trips where they've completely forgotten to wear the seatbelt, trips where they unbuckle the seatbelt towards the end of the trip or forget to buckle the seatbelt at the beginning of the trip. And then there's a tendency on short trips to not buckle at all. So in any case, the techniques that we've developed we think are transferable to industry, both immediately and with high value. So we're, like I said, we're currently in the process of an NSF evaluation. And when we finish that in November, we'll be embarking on a final business plan in January, whether that is the bootstrapping through the 10,000 unit deployments that we have planned, or if it means going out and getting additional venture capital.
Any questions?
Yes?
What do you mean bootstrapping?
The business plan that we have currently in place is significant in that if we get a 10,000 unit deployment, the business starts up by itself without venture capital. And it depends on the structure of how the money flows in. But the deals that we've worked with these 2 private companies provide enough money on the revenues that we can operate as a business and expand our business using the money that we generate through the revenues from those 10,000 unit deployments. So bootstrapping meaning you don't have to go get venture capital in order to start. You start with a customer, a specific customer, and a contract that allows you to build the business with them.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that presentation. Next, to talk to us about bioscience incentives, Dr. Lee Heron. Did I pronounce that right? Okay. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. So it's been requested, so we'll do it. Dr. Heron, if you could make your way down, we'll get started. Everyone mind taking your seats, we'll get things back on track. Dr. Heron, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you. Good morning. My name is Lee Heron. I'm General Manager of Biosciences for the Enterprise Innovation Institute here at Georgia Tech. And I've been asked to speak to you regarding bioscience incentives. And so what I'd like to do this morning is talk a little bit about the bioscience industries, what comprises bioscience, impact in the state of Georgia, specifically here at Georgia Tech as well, and then national trends with regard to bioscience initiatives and incentives. It's a very active area. Provide a couple of specific examples in neighboring states, talk about what we're doing here in the state of Georgia, and then end with some specific recommendations and try to do that within the allotted time. So first, as far as the bioscience industry, it's actually a collection of industries. It encompasses drugs and pharmaceuticals, research and testing, agricultural feedstocks and chemicals, as well as medical devices and equipment. So you can see it's very broad, very diverse. But despite this diversity, there are some common elements. Usually there's a very strong association with research universities, and Georgia is no exception. We've had, in this state, we have many companies associated with Georgia Tech, Emory, University of Georgia, and other state institutions. Products are universally regulated, whether it be by the FDA, the EPA, the USDA, or other federal agencies, as well as similar agencies outside the U.S. The industries are all, for the most part, research intensive, which means that they're going to spend several years, a few to many years, doing research and development, not generating revenue, operating at a loss prior to turning the corner and being profitable. As far as the impact in Georgia, the Georgia Biomedical Partnership, which is an industry group, recently commissioned a study to look at the impact in the state. And findings actually were not too surprising. Biosciences are generally regarded as having high-paying salaries. And as you can see here, $57,000, in excess of $57,000 a year, that's greater than $20,000 more than the average non-bioscience salary. Sales are increasing and are forecast to reach $6.2 billion in 2006. Also, I think we're all familiar with the potential benefits of the industry in terms of health care, agricultural productivity, that sort of thing. Employment, although relatively small and from a grand scheme, is actually increasing fairly well. It exceeded 15,000 individuals in 2005. That doesn't include the greater than 6,500 CDC employees and probably well over 2,000 to 3,000 in other universities throughout the state. Also, in contrast to many other industries in the state, we're seeing some very interesting metrics in terms of growth. 38% increase in the number of companies from 2001 to 2005, 11% increase in the number of employees, and a 30% increase in wages. Specifically, what are we doing here at Georgia Tech in terms of biosciences? At Georgia Tech, we're focusing on what I would call convergence opportunities. Those opportunities where you have a biotech problem that requires an engineering solution. Includes clinical applications, many of which are joint projects with Emory University. Probably at least half the projects I'm involved with are joint projects with Emory. But we touch on all areas of bioscience. Industrial process improvements and clean fuels. For those who were here early this morning, you heard Ben Hill talk about clean energy. Just recently, well, within the last 12 months, one department within Georgia Tech has received over $50 million in NIH funding, specifically in the biosciences, which is truly significant. It's probably one of the, well, I don't know of any other institution in the nation that has received that kind of an award in a relatively short period of time. Also, we're seeing a steadily increasing number of invention disclosures and patent applications. And again, one of the charts that Ben showed earlier was Georgia Tech's productivity with regard to disclosures. We're getting an average of 1 disclosure a day. Now, in terms of national trends, biosciences have become an area of intense economic development activity, essentially in all 50 states. At least 44 states are building life sciences R&D capability and emphasizing that. 46 states are offering financial support, indirect financial support to their companies, and 22 of those states are making direct investments into bioscience companies. Pretty much with every state economic and regional economic development agency that you come across, you talk to, look at their literature, they're targeting bioscience development for several reasons. It's a clean energy, improves the health of the citizens, and creates jobs that are high-paying jobs. Now, how are states differentiating themselves? And I think that's where we sort of want to focus here a little bit. You know, the strengths of Georgia and how we can improve that. But there's some key points of differentiation. First and foremost are engaged research institutions. Again, as I said early on, biosciences tends to be R&D intensive. There's a close association with universities. How does Georgia rank on that? I give us an A. We have excellent universities that are very commercially oriented. Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, Emory University, and the other state institutions are all very engaged in supporting commercialization of technology. Also very important to have some discretionary funds to leverage federal grant dollars. Federal grant dollars are obligated. They're encumbered for certain activities. It's important to have a source of funds that we can leverage to further the commercial development of technologies coming out of those federal dollars. We actually get, I think, a B+, primarily through the Georgia Research Alliance. The GRA is it's a model system. I'll be talking actually quite a bit about that, but do a very good job of leveraging federal dollars. Third is available risk capital to help transition products from the universities into the commercial marketplace. As I said early on, many of these companies operate at a loss for several years as they're doing the R&D, developing products, introducing them to the market. Risk capital is usually in the form of venture capital. We probably get no better than a C on that. Atlanta, while we do have some venture capital, we have very limited bioscience-focused venture capital. And this region has somewhat limited bioscience venture capital. It's better than it was 5 years ago, but we're still average at best. The workforce and talent pool, and this is one of the biggest issues I deal with in trying to transition technologies out of the university, is finding appropriately skilled and experienced managers to take technologies and take companies and develop successful entities. And again, I would, at this point, give us a C. Again, we're better than we were 5 years ago, but we've got some room for improvement. Access to facilities and equipment. It's a key issue that many states are concentrating on, trying to provide companies and universities state-of-the-art equipment that's needed now to practice, to effectively reduce to concept bioscience technologies. And actually, again, largely, through enlightened administration at many of the universities and the GRA, we're better than average. We do make equipment available to companies, and we also provide our faculty members with a lot of state-of-the-art equipment. And then from a state level, do we have a supportive business, tax, and regulatory policy? And nationwide, many states are looking at this. What can be done at the state level to encourage growth of this industry, both providing incentives at the university level as well as at the commercialization or company level? And this, again, we're average. Many states are taking quite aggressive approaches. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples. Now, state and university support for the bioscience industry really is at two levels. It tends to be focused at the state universities in many cases, again, recognizing that these entities, commercialization, are strongly university associated and research and development intensive. So they're research focused, and then they're commercialization focused also. So what can state and universities do? Again, these are national trends. They tend to invest in bioscience R&D through creating centers of excellence in universities. We've done a very good job of that here in the state of Georgia. They're providing federal dollars, or providing dollars to match federal and other grant funding. Again, we have limited funds available through the Georgia Research Alliance for this purpose. States also are investing in facilities and equipment. And I made a note here, this is critical to recruit star faculty. It's absolutely true. To recruit key star faculty, they want to go to universities that have absolute state-of-the-art equipment and support, because that helps them get the federal grant dollars. It's a formula for success that we've seen play out very well here at Georgia Tech, actually at Emory also. It's also important to bring in those high-quality faculty, the trendsetters and thought leaders on a national level. And the GRA 10 years ago set up a program called the Eminent Scholars. You may be familiar with that. It's actually become a national model to recruit that many other states are trying to emulate, to bring in the rock stars, if you will, the bioscience research and development efforts. Another thing that many states are doing is encouraging academic and industrial collaboration. And that's, again, where Georgia has actually done a very good job through matching grant programs, creating core labs that industry has access to, and also, more recently, creating some university-associated research parks so that companies can progress from incubation into the research parks. Universities are also putting money into a commercialization effort. Basically, state universities in particular have, many of them will cite three primary goals and objectives: teaching, research, and public service. And economic development is often cited as a strong component of that public service element. That's commercialization. So many times universities we're seeing this an increasing trend to fund commercialization centers. And we actually have an example here, which is the Advanced Technology Development Center, which has been around 26 years, and again, it tends to be a national model. States also are creating technology development and commercialization funds. And for those of you who are here for the last three speakers, I've heard Venture Lab mentioned over the last three speakers. I'm going to talk briefly about that as well, but that's a great model of technology development and commercialization funds. In many states, well, I shouldn't say many. In fact, I only know of 3 states that are actually sort of leading the pack with tax-based incentives with regard to university-specific intellectual property, providing tax incentives to individuals and businesses that invest in technology licensed from state institutions, provide an incentive to take technology from the universities into the commercial marketplace. Now, there are several states that are also looking at providing direct support to industry through capital, and many times this is done through tax credits. R&D tax credit, which Georgia has, it's a great program, but for bioscience companies, because there's such a long time to profitability where credits could be applied, it doesn't have too much benefit for the companies themselves. Several states have adopted tax credits for investment in venture capital funds, knowing that venture capital is the lifeblood of the bioscience industry, providing appropriate incentives to stimulate investment in venture capital funds. Also, tax credit for direct investment, seed-level investments in bioscience companies. Several states have adopted transferable and refundable non-operating losses. Georgia has a non-operating loss carry forward, but there are states, that Connecticut being one, where you can actually put 65% of an operating loss back to the state and get a refund, or you can transfer them to another company as a means to creating capital. Georgia is one of 4 states, I believe, that doesn't allocate any of its pension funds to venture capital. And I've been told that that is a factor in influencing venture capital coming to the state of Georgia. States are also creating facilities funds, and Georgia is no exception in this regard. Connecticut was one of the first states to do it. They've set a good model. Georgia has created a facilities fund specifically for biosciences. I know one company has been funded, and there's another one that is proceeding down the path right now that does have a positive impact. States are also looking at more direct services to the entrepreneurs, and this is more workforce development, I would say. Creating entrepreneurial support services, similar to some of the programs we have underway at the ATDC. And then bioscience workforce and training programs. North Carolina excels at that. The state of Georgia, through its ICAP program, also has a mechanism in place to provide workforce training. And then there are some states that are becoming extremely aggressive. One state in particular, which I'll mention, in just outright buying major research institutes to relocate. Something I don't necessarily, well, the jury's out whether that strategy will work, but this is just to give you a flavor of what some states are doing and how competitive developing a bioscience industry nationwide is. I'll give you a specific example. I mentioned North Carolina a bit earlier. We're talking about 2 of our neighbors. Our neighbor to the northeast. North Carolina has a group called the North Carolina Biotechnology Center. It's a state-funded entity. They receive about $6 million a year from the state. Just for operations. They provide a lot of grants to university-based researchers with commercializable technology. They've recently proposed $145 million a year for workforce training. That's on top of an approved $65 million spending bill to support workforce training specifically for biomanufacturing. The state has constructed a biomanufacturing training facility actually on the campus of North Carolina State, and they're using that to train their individuals to work in the industry. One of the things that the Biotech Center does that is actually very beneficial is they provide a bridging program for small business innovative research, the SBIR program. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it's a federal program. SBIR program requires that federal institutes with over $500 million annual funding, and most of those fit into that category, set aside 2.5% to small business in a competitive grant program. There are several phases, but there are gaps between these phases. North Carolina, recognizing those gaps, has created a gap-filling grant program. North Carolina is one of the states that does offer tax credits for individuals and companies licensing technology from state institutions. They also created a separate bonding authority specifically for the life sciences and are using that actually to fund facilities. And North Carolina, not unlike a lot of states, Georgia included, does have several incubators. Another example is our neighbor to the south, Florida, which 5 years ago most people would have said Florida was sort of a non-player in biosciences. Although they've got some very good institutions, the state had not targeted bioscience as a major priority for economic development. Didn't rank up there with tourism. Well, that's changed. They are spending a lot of money. Over $500 million has been committed from Palm Beach County as well as the state to recruit the Scripps Institute, or a unit of the Scripps Institute from San Diego. Scripps isn't leaving San Diego. They're establishing an East Coast presence in Florida. It's projected over the next 15 years to yield many thousands of jobs to spin-off industry, that sort of thing. In addition, just this summer, the state committed, and Orange County committed over $300 million to recruit another San Diego area institute, the Burnham Institute, to set up their East Coast operations. So they're spending a lot of money. Again, it's not clear whether that's, whether you can buy a bioscience industry, which is what they're trying to do. One of the things the state of Florida has done is commit $1 billion of their $105 billion state pension fund, specifically for venture capital targeted to Florida-based companies. Again, this recognizes the fact that this industry is highly dependent on venture capital. Florida, unlike the state of Georgia, has limited incubator space, but do have a very good incubator at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Now, what are we doing here in the state of Georgia? I've mentioned a couple of other states. They're doing some progressive things, but actually Georgia is too. We've got room for improvement, but we've actually done very well. In fact, Georgia ranks 7th in the Ernst & Young survey of states with biotech entities. We've got, I think we've got 668 at last count biotech establishments, and that puts us 7th on the list, which is actually, being in the top 10 is great. But the issue, the entity that we talk most about in the state of Georgia is the Georgia Research Alliance. Established 11, 12 years ago, it's become a national model for many other states. We have the Eminent Scholars Program, which I mentioned earlier, to recruit high-level trendsetters, thought leaders to the state. Venture Lab program is another GRA initiative, and the last 3 speakers that were up here mentioned Venture Lab, and I think that's indicative of, and we didn't coordinate our talks, but that's important. It's indicative of how important Venture Lab is. It provides seed-level funding, management support, commercialization support to faculty entrepreneurs. Not that they're going to quit their day jobs, but they have technology that's commercializable, and Venture Lab program helps them realize that commercial potential. It's become a GRA initiative. GRA also has a university industry matching grant program for industry interested in sponsoring research in the universities. The GRA will actually fund up to $100,000, 50% of the cost of those sponsored research. It's a great asset to companies, particularly smaller growing companies. And the Georgia Research Alliance supports our network of incubators. We have incubators at Georgia Tech, Emory University, Georgia State, University of Georgia, and they're all full. And they get a lot of support from the GRA. Georgia Cancer Coalition, the primary recipient of tobacco settlement money, is also doing a lot of work in the institutions in improving and fostering a bioscience commercialization through funding key researchers in the cancer area. The state has a facilities fund. We've talked a little bit about that. We have a bioscience seed fund created 3 to 4 years ago. It was actually increased this last legislative session. That fund has been very active lately. We've made 9 investments to date in local companies coming out of universities that we hope will grow, develop, and prosper. And then the ATDC and other incubators in the state are providing support to our companies. It's more than just the real estate. We do provide entrepreneurial support, advice regarding business plans, marketing, regulatory, that sort of thing. Venture Lab, it's been mentioned. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because Ben actually covered it, I think, pretty well in his presentation. It was founded in 2001. We do provide small amounts of grant funding, $50,000 to $100,000, specifically for the purpose, not of doing basic research, really not applied research. It's to take that research that's in the lab and transition that research to the commercial marketplace. Venture Lab also endeavors to pair interesting technologies with commercial potential with capable management. And our goal is to create successful startup companies. Overall, because Venture Lab isn't focused just on the biosciences, but just the Venture Lab program here at Georgia Tech, I think we've funded it probably well over 11 startup companies that have raised in excess of $20 million. So we get great leverage for Venture Lab funds. Okay, what can Georgia do? What can we do? We're doing a good job, but what can we do better to really put us, say, in the top 5 nationally in terms of bioscience companies? Specifically, we can increase the support of the GRA and Cancer Coalition. These are great programs. They've proven to be successful. They're very efficiently run organizations. Additional support for the Facilities Fund. We have many companies in our incubators. They're at the point where within the next 12 months to 36 months, they're going to be graduating. They'll outgrow our incubation facility. They will need to move to, into the real world in terms of finding space, developing space, that sort of thing. This Facilities Fund is very useful. The cost to build out laboratory space can exceed $250 per square foot. Very expensive. The Facilities Fund is going to be vitally important to make sure that Georgia remains competitive and that we don't lose some of these companies to other states. We can also increase the entrepreneurial support program, such as that offered by ATDC. There's been discussion of a commercialization center centrally located that provides managed support entrepreneurial training. Those are the kind of things that the state could help support. Another issue is venture investing. That's truly the lifeblood of bioscience industry. There are 2 key areas. That's the Bay Area in California and Boston, which are the centers of the universe in terms of venture capital. Doesn't mean we don't have some here, but we don't have a lot of venture capital. We have venture fundable companies here that actually are leaving the state because they cannot get funded here. Creating a fund in the state will keep some of those companies here. As I mentioned earlier, Georgia is one of 4 states that doesn't, his pension fund is not invested in venture capital. That would make a difference. And there are certain tax policies. Credit for investment in venture capital funds or in direct investment in angel funds or tax credits for investment in technology companies. And then having some liquidity with the non-operating losses, either transferable or refundable. Those are mechanisms that companies can use to raise additional capital. And one of the things that's emerging in many states is discussion of an SBIR or STTR gap funding. Again, recognizing that those federal programs take a long time. There's big gaps between funding gaps. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's critical to the success of the companies. So with that, I'll close. Any questions?
Thank you.
Got one question.
I was interested in the creation of the venture capital fund. In other states, is that done by the state itself or by a conglomerate of private interest, or how is that created?
Many states have done that themselves. Indiana, for instance, has created Indiana Ventures Fund. Some states they're bringing in professional management, but they're creating the fund themselves. Other states are creating a fund of funds. They're creating a pool to invest in venture capital funds with It's difficult to require, but a certain percentage of their funds must be invested in their home state. So there's a couple of different models.
All right, thank you for that presentation. And if you would, assuming you haven't already done this, if you would get that presentation to this committee so that we can have that, and any more detail that you might can provide specifically on some of those tax incentives and regulations that other states may have put in place, you referenced earlier in your presentation. That'd be very helpful for this committee if you could supply that information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next is, I don't know if I need to try to pronounce that or not. Is it Gangbao? That's what I thought. Dr. Gangbao, if you'd please make your way up. This is our last presentation before we break for lunch. And in case I fail to mention it, when we get through here, we'll reconvene about 12:45.
Thank you so much. My name is Gan Bao. I'm a professor at the Department of Biomedical Engineering, Georgia Tech Emory. Also, I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup company called Vivonetics. What I would like to discuss with you today is the nanomedicine area, which is really the emerging nanotechnologies for medicine. So nanomedicine is really the development of engineered devices of nanoscales, which is typically 1 to 100 nanometers. So we want to use those structures or devices for the diagnosis and the treatment of specific diseases such as cancer. So Georgia is already a leader in nanomedicine. So the reason is that over the last 2 years, we got 3 NIH centers in nanomedicine. The first one is from NIHLBI of NIH, which is called Programs of Excellence in Nanotechnology, or PIN. So our center at Emory Georgia Tech is focused on developing nanotechnologies for the detection and the analysis of plaque formation. I'm the PI, which the center has a funding of $11.5 million for 5 years. So that's the first center we got from NIH. The second one is from National Cancer Institute, NCI. It's called Center of Cancer Nanotechnology Excellence, or CCNE. So our center at Georgia Tech Emory is focused on personalized and predictive oncology. My colleague Shuming Ni is a PI. The funding is about $90 million for 5 years. So the last one, actually we got this one just a few weeks ago, is from NIH Roadmap Initiative in Nanomedicine. It's called Nanomedicine Development Centers, or NDC. So our center is focused on nuclear protein machines. I'm the PI. We'll have funding up to $10 million for 5 years. You can see just those 3 centers from NIH, we have more than $40 million for 5 years. So the truth is, Georgia and California are the only 2 states that have all 3 types of nanomedicine centers, that is CCNE, PIN, and NDC. So that's why we are truly a national leader now in nanomedicine. So, for example, in the cardiovascular area, of course, many people know that this is a big disease. It's the leading cause of death in the US. So essentially, 1 out of every 4 Americans has cardiovascular disease. Of course, that's a huge number. Every 30 seconds, 1 person dies from this disease. Although we have performed research for the last many years, quite a few decades, there is still a lack of understanding of the fundamental biology and the pathophysiology of the plaque formation especially the molecular mechanisms that's underlying the plaque formation. So as a result, we do not have good tools for early detection of plaque formation. Also, we do not have good drugs for treating the cardiovascular diseases. So that's why NIH wants to form national centers to develop nanotechnologies focusing on cardiovascular disease. So our center, as I mentioned, is a team between Georgia Tech and Emory. We have many excellent investigators from Emory. We are so fortunate to have the chair of medicine at Emory on the team. We have, of course, our dean of engineering here on the team. So we have many excellent bioengineers from Georgia Tech on the team. So those are the 6 technologies we are developing under the center grant. The first one is so-called molecular beacons, which is a tool for detecting gene expression in living cells. I will give you more details on this. The second one is to use quantum dots, which are nanocrystals, as a fluorescent label to study protein-protein interactions in living cells. The third one is to use quantum dots as a reporter for animal studies of plaque formation. As you can see, we essentially functionalize those nanocrystals, trying to detect plaques in animals. The fourth project is to develop another nanoparticle-based technology, which is based on iron oxide. Since iron oxide is not toxic, we want to use this as a tool to detect plaques in humans. The last 2 are really so-called pilot projects. This one is to develop better contrast agents using MRI for plaque detection. And the last one is to develop newer probes to detect free radicals in cells. So those are really advanced nanotechnologies we want to develop in terms of addressing issues in cardiovascular disease. The new center we just got is called Nanomedicine Center for Nuclear Protein Machines. We have an outstanding team from Georgia Tech, Emory, from Medical College of Georgia, and then from many other schools such as MIT, Caltech, the German Cancer Research Center, and also from NYU Medical Center. So we have a strong team to focus on studies of nuclear proteins. Those protein complexes, as you may know, are responsible for many essential biological processes in living cells, such as the synthesis, modification, and repair of DNA and RNA. So those are the molecules that store all the genetic information. The truth is many events, such as metabolic activities and environmental effects or factors, could alter the genome, that is to induce DNA damage. So those damage, if remain unrepaired, will lead to premature aging, programmed cell death, or unregulated cell division. So all the last 2 events actually typically cause cancer. So what we want to do is we want to develop innovative technologies, nanotechnologies, to understand the structure-function relationships of those protein complexes we call DNA repair nanomachines. So the long-term goal is to have to establish this understanding, then to apply this understanding to modify the genome so that we can cure a wide range of diseases, including cancer. So that is, we could use these tools to reprogram the cellular machines, such as those protein complexes, so that we will be able to precisely modify the genome for our own purposes. Let me just focus on one technology we have been developing, which is to do living cell gene detection. There are a lot of needs for such a technology. For example, we have a lot of needs in molecular biology studies. We want to perform disease detection and diagnosis. We also want to use the tool for drug discovery. So we have a lot of technologies for drug discovery, but they are not good enough. For example, we want to use so-called cell-based assays for drug discovery, but we do not have a good tool to quantify the gene expression in living cells. So therefore, to develop this technology for drug discovery is a very important goal. So here is really the technology we developed called molecular beacon probes. It's a tiny, small sensor. So the size of this is about 6 nanometers. So essentially, we identify our targets, which typically are the messenger RNAs in living cells. So the loop portion is complementary to the target, just using base pairing. Then again, we have 2 segments. By base pairing, we can tie the ends together to form a so-called hairpin. Then at the very end, we have a dye molecule and a quencher. The quencher quenches fluorescence of the dye. So initially, it's dark no matter what you do. So when you have targets in solution or in cells, there's a transition between single-stranded, which is the molecular beacon, to double-stranded, which is this case, so that the quencher moves away, the beacon opens up. Now we have fluorescence. So our idea is to use this as a tool to detect gene expression in living cells. So a specific design is to use 2 molecular beacons. One has a donor dye, the other has an acceptor dye. By measuring the fluorescence due to energy transfer, we can increase the sensitivity. We have also developed 2 technologies to deliver these beacons into living cells. One is based on toxins. The toxin generates pores of about 35 nanometers on the cell membrane so that the beacons can get into cells. The other one is to have a peptide which carries the beacon into cells. There's no competing technologies in terms of living cell gene detection. We have many so-called in vitro methods such as RT-PCR, Northern blotting, or DNA microarrays. But those technologies are based on cell lysis. That means you have to smash cells to get the genetic material. But in that case, you cannot obtain any dynamic information in terms of the temporal or spatial alterations or changes of gene expression in living cells. There's another tool called fluorescence in situ hybridization, or people call that fish. It's not the fish we eat. Those assays actually require fixation of cells, and of course, once you fix cells, you cannot detect the dynamics of gene expression in living cells. So other things like fluorescence proteins or other so-called reporter systems, those can measure specific aspects of gene expression, but they are not so-called endogenous. That is, you alter gene expression level by doing so. So therefore, the tool we develop is very unique. Just to show you some examples, we can detect a cancer gene called KRAS in living cells with high sensitivity. We have a comparison that is, if we use RT-PCR, which is labor intensive, we can get a factor 2 in specific cell types. With our technology, we have a factor 2.2, which is very close, but it's much simpler using this assay. Another very exciting aspect is that we can see the messenger RNA localization in living cells. Like in this case, we have a single cell. This is a cell nucleus. You can see that the messenger RNAs are all localized in a filament fashion. Another very important application is cancer detection. In this case, we detect the mutations of the specific genes as a way to target cancer cells. As you may know, many cancers are due to mutations of the genome. In this case, we designed molecular beacons to target the KRAS gene at codon 12. We have mutations such as GGT to G80. So we have a cell line PANC1 which has this mutation. You can see when we throw beacons in, you see a high level of fluorescence. We have another cancer cell line which has a different mutation, GGT to TGT. You can see that even though we throw beacons in, there's not much signal out. So it's a good way to detect cancer because in this case, only the cancer cells show fluorescence. Normal cells will not give you fluorescence. So the idea is to take blood sample or to have a small amount of tissue from the body. Then we throw beacons in to see if we do have cells showing fluorescence, very likely those are cancer cells. Otherwise, you just see a dark image, which means there's no cancer cell. Another very important application of this technology is to detect viral infection. So recently we used a model system called RSV, which is so-called respiratory syncytial virus. It's a virus that causes sickness of many children. So just to show how specific it is, this is the white light image of cells. You can see a bunch of cells here and there. So when the cells are infected by the virus, we designed a molecular beacon to target the genome of the virus. So in this image, the red signal, you can see red spots. That is really the detection of the viral genome. We also targeted a viral protein. So those signals showing in green, that is from the detection of viral protein. As a contrast, you can see if the cells are not infected, you really don't see much. Okay, so that is a very rapid, sensitive way to detect cells that are being infected by viruses. Although this is just a model system, the same approach should work for viral infections such as SARS a few years ago. Of course, nowadays the bird flu is a big problem. So we want to develop this technology in collaboration with CDC so that we can have a powerful tool for viral infection detection. So this is a summary of the technology. It has a very high sensitivity. Using quantum dots, we can reach 1 to 10 copies per cell sensitivity. Or with just organic dyes, we can reach 10 to 100 copies per cell sensitivity. It is very specific. We can detect single base mutations, as I showed you. We can do multiplexing. That means we can detect 3 to 5 different genes simultaneously in living cells. We have developed 2 methods for delivery, so it's not a problem. It is very, very versatile because we can detect many different RNAs, such as messenger RNAs, small nuclear RNAs, pre-messenger RNAs. We can reach very high signal-to-noise ratio. We can also increase the stability of beacons by modifying the backbone. To commercialize this technology, we have a company called Biomedical. Lee mentioned that we have a incubation space in the so-called ES&T building on Georgia Tech campus. This company is in that incubation space. It's a private held startup company in biotechnology, founded and incorporated in 2003, about 3 years ago. So we have $2 million in funding. Some of those are from Georgia Research Alliance. We have phase 1 and phase 2 commercialization grants from GRA. They also mentioned the Venture Lab program. Actually, the company was started with the help of Venture Lab program. In fact, the co-founder of this company was a Venture Lab fellow. So Venture Lab actually played a very important role in forming this company. We also got NIH and NCI STTR phase 1 and phase 2 grants. So the mission of the company is to create innovative products for the in vivo detection, localization, and quantitation of target nucleic acids and proteins. So our target of our products, of course, are molecular beacons and other derivative products, as I will show you later. So the application areas of the technology, for now we focus on drug discovery, which of course has a huge market. We also want to focus on molecular biology research, which has a relatively small market, but many, many labs need to use molecular beacons for live cell gene detection. In the future, we want to perform clinical pharmacogenomics using this tool to determine treatment efficacy. And also we want to do novel medical diagnostics using this technology, such as doing cancer detection with high sensitivity. So this is a list of the products, current and future products. We have dual thread molecular beacons, which has an enhanced sensitivity and specificity, also with low background signal. We developed a peptide-linked molecular beacons, especially for delivery of beacons into cells, even tissues. We are developing the so-called quantum dot-based molecular beacons to have a better sensitivity. We also have the magnetic nanoparticle-based probes, really for deep tissue imaging using MRI. So the idea is in the future we can target tumors or plaques, early-stage tumors or plaques in the body using MRI. And we, of course, are developing other products. So the support of the state in terms of startup funds, to support venture capital funds, to support, like Lee mentioned, to support the funds to fill the gaps between phase 1 and phase 2 small business grants will be very critical in terms of commercialize nanotechnologies. Thank you so much.
It seemed that most of this is in detecting the cancer. How do you cure it once you detect it?
That's an excellent question. So, in fact, we have been looking into that. A very important issue in curing cancer, number one, of course, is to detect cancer early. If you can only detect late-stage tumors, large tumors, no matter what you do, the patients will die. So the key is to do early cancer detection, which is what we are focusing on. But the treatment is also a very important aspect. So one critical issue of treating early-stage tumor is to deliver drug molecules specific to the tumor site when the tumors are small. So what we do now is to combine the imaging approaches in terms of delivery, because in imaging a tumor, you need to deliver the contrast agent to the tumor anyway. So what we want to do is to combine that with treatment. That is, on the contrast agent, we will also have drug molecules so that we can not only image the tumor, we can also kill cancer cells. So that's the approach we are taking now.
Thank you. We certainly do appreciate that presentation, Dr. Bao. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
At this point, we will break for lunch, and it's almost noon now, so we will reconvene here at 1 o'clock. Get started by then. I can give you at least a full hour to grab a bite, but we'll adjourn until 1. Next on the agenda is Dr. Marilyn Brown. She's going to present to us about energy policy. So if we could pay attention to her, we'd appreciate it. Dr. Brown?
My way.
You find it?
There we go.
Go ahead and get started.
All right. Whoop. I do have a handout. I think I brought about 20 or 25 copies, so let me know if you don't get one. I'll get one to you later.
I'm going to talk with you today about energy policy options for the state of Georgia, doing a little bit of benchmarking against what other states are doing around the country. Starting first with sort of a broad national picture and then honing in on Georgia. So there is a wide range of views as to how seriously we should be taking the energy crisis. Some people say that it's largely contrived, it's just a matter of price manipulation. If we could let the markets operate efficiently, we'd have affordable energy. Or the energy resource experts say there's plenty of oil in the ground, we just need to turn to some unconventional sources, or they'll say there's plenty of solar, or let technology fly. Let's put those solar collectors onto satellites and beam that power down, and we won't have any energy crisis. So I think there really is a question at large as to whether or not energy resources and technologies today can meet the growing demands of an expanding economy. So some of what I've done over the past year is to develop an indicator of energy sustainability, and it has 12 different measures divided into 4 categories: oil security, electric reliability, energy efficiency, and environmental quality. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail. In February, you can buy my book. You'll get it in inexhaustible detail. But for oil security, the indicators are all in the negative direction in terms of oil imports and the price of oil. The production of non-petroleum transportation fuels has actually gone down over the past 30 years. What I've compared in this little box is how we were doing pre-Arab oil embargo of '73 with how we're doing today using the latest statistics. And so even when it comes to displacing petroleum for transportation, we're not doing well. And of course, the average fuel economy of the nation's fleet has plateaued since its early improvements in the first part of the 70s and 80s. In terms of electric reliability, we have issues with respect to natural gas. It used to be we produced almost all of our own natural gas, but now we are importing 15% of it. It's going the same way that petroleum is. And the principal reason for this inability to meet our own demands is because natural gas has become the fuel of choice for electric power production. And with that has come a surge of demand that's driven up prices. So the second indicator has to do with the price of electric power, which is natural gas for electric power, and then electric retail prices all going up. And this last indicator is a reflection of our weakening energy infrastructure. Just taking one indicator, that's the transmission grid. We're investing much less every year in new transmission lines than we used to, dropping from $5 billion a year to a $2 billion a year investment. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we also are not building oil refineries, and we aren't building liquid natural gas ports, and it's tremendous. We're not putting our wind farms up where there's continuous local resistance to new facilities of all sorts. Environmental quality, a little bit of good news here. In the green, you can see that emissions of sulfur dioxide have in fact dropped quite markedly over the past 30 years. So we've seen some good cleanup, but carbon dioxide is marching forward, ever continuously rising in terms of rates of emissions. And in energy efficiency, again, we've got one good indicator. That is the intensity with which we use energy as a nation has been dropping. Here, in terms of thousands of BTU per dollar GDP, we've seen some tremendous gains. If we instead had continued to use energy today as we did in 1970, we'd be paying $1 billion a day more for energy. So we've saved ourselves a lot of money by using energy more wisely. But it turns out, while that has dropped, energy use per capita is climbing. Not climbing, it's rising. We're not able to actually turn the corner in terms of efficiency, being able to compensate for the growth of energy services. We all want more plug loads in our buildings, more plug-in devices in commercial offices, and in every aspect of our life, we're becoming more demanding. So I would argue that we're near crisis. And with crisis comes opportunity, and you've heard about some of these today, this morning, in terms of technology advances being made here at Georgia Tech. In the Southeast, we have particular opportunities in the energy efficiency area. It's the fastest growing region in the country in terms of population and housing and immigration and in-migration. Yet its energy efficiency initiatives and actions fall behind other regions. For instance, there are many ways to show this. The Southeast spends only 1/5 of the national average per capita on energy efficiency programs. And if you look at the penetration of Energy Star appliances, the Southeast lags behind other regions. So the key is to move best practices into the marketplace and to translate more research into new solutions. So be working on the technology frontier while at the same time moving those best practices into place. And to help do that, the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance was created just about a month ago to try to share best practices across southern states. And at the first board of directors meeting last week in Atlanta, I was elected president of the board, so if you want to talk about that alliance, I'd be pleased to afterwards. Your ideas for what it might do, how you might want to be engaged with it. And this just shows again some of those technologies which we can translate into solutions and business opportunities. I wanted to show you what California and New England has been doing in terms of meeting their energy service demands. Over the past 40 years, well, let's say, I should say, since the energy crisis of the early 70s, California has managed to meet its electricity consumption without having to expand its generation. Kilowatt hours per capita, I said that too cavalierly, kilowatt hours per capita have been flat, while for the nation, kilowatt hours per capita have risen quite extensively. So they have had to expand their generation, but that's because population is growing. It's not because consumption per person has been rising. And the same is true in the state of Vermont and for many of the states in New England. So here is Vermont, and this is kilowatt hours per customer per year. It reached a peak sometime in the 70s and has gone down since then. So the track of Georgia, I am sure, is more like the red line, if not above it, in terms of the rise of electricity per capita. Some of the success stories, if you don't believe me, let's just look at the household refrigerator. In 1970, you used 2,000 kilowatt hours for a standard 22 cubic foot refrigerator. And today, when you go to buy one, it can only consume 620 or 30 kilowatt hours per year or less due to federal standards that have been introduced over the course of the last 25 years. So improvements to new technology, the compressors are more efficient, the motors, the insulation that's used, and the result is you're using 1/3 the energy for your refrigerator that you used to. Well, you might say, that's not that big a deal. But why don't we roll it up for the entire nation and talk about the stock of 150 million refrigerators that are owned by households across the U.S. that have been bought with the 2001 efficiency standard. If you sum up the energy savings that has occurred comparing the old refrigerator against the new, that efficiency exceeds, the energy saved by one household appliance, the refrigerator, exceeds all of the power produced by the nation's entire hydropower, all the dams, and almost as much as its nuclear reactors. So we're talking big potential. So I wanted to now give you the benchmarking I promised, what states are doing to try to tap into that potential for the future. In terms of residential codes, there are various ages of codes. In fact, there are some states with no statewide code. Georgia does pretty well. It has in place the International Energy Conservation Code which was promulgated in the 98-2001 period, not the latest, but fairly recent. And in the commercial state energy code area, it's got the best. So it's got the gold standard there. Now, in order to drive more efficiency into the marketplace, many states have elected to put state standards on appliances, going either above standards that the feds promulgate or taking appliances that aren't currently regulated and creating standards. So here we have a set of states that have done that. And one of my favorite approaches is a policy which states have been experimenting with lately. It's called the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard. And here the state requires that electric utilities meet a certain percent of the growth in their demand through efficiency. For instance, the state of Texas requires that 10% of the future electricity growth be met through efficiency. And it is very well documented and precisely monitored. The programs they run deliver those savings. And last of the energy efficiency programs are green building standards for state buildings, which are in place in many states across the U.S., but not in Georgia. And I added this little note, we talked about this last week, how most of the states around the country that are living up to state green building standards, they get that job done by allowing energy services companies to come in and spend their money, private money, to upgrade buildings, and those companies get repaid based on taking a percent of the savings. So these improvements don't cost the state anything. They do have to put the contracts in place, and they probably have some legal costs and some monitoring costs, but in the end, they end up with better buildings, and they pay less in their bills. This is not an option currently available to the state of Georgia because of some statutory limitations in its constitution, and some energy service companies are trying to fix that. And for those of you who have any influence and maybe legal staff, it'd be great if you could work on that. By the way, I've only been in Atlanta 2 months, so I have to confess I don't know that much about Georgia's energy policies. I have been reading a lot and read the proposed draft state energy plan, et cetera, but I'm sure you'll see my depth is a little shallow. Renewable portfolio standards is the area I wanted to end with in terms of benchmarking. These are standards that states set that require a certain percentage of the electricity generated or consumed, sold by the utilities, have to be produced through renewable resources, wind, photovoltaics, landfill, methane, and such. And you can see that there are something like 21, 22 states in the District of Columbia that have these renewable portfolio standards in place, and some of them are quite aggressive. So, for instance, the state of California, 20% of their electricity is to be green by the year 2017. Maine with 30%, up and down the coast and in the West and the Midwest. Now, I am not suggesting that Georgia should quickly run and imitate these renewable portfolio standards because unfortunately, Georgia is not blessed with the vast renewable resources that other regions of the country have. So I'm going to run through a set of slides to show you what Georgia does have relative to the rest of the nation. So these are a set of slides I borrowed from Chuck Kutcher from the National Renewable Energy Lab. He gave a presentation this summer where he builds a case for how the U.S. could reduce its carbon emissions through clean and efficient energy use. And he starts off looking at photovoltaics. Okay, so let's build a case down here. We've got 125 million tons of carbon that could be saved by putting more photovoltaics in place. Well, you can see the Southeast has a pretty good resource, but not what it is in the Southwest. And so PV systems are a little more costly and less efficient here than elsewhere. Now take a look at the next resource is concentrating solar power. This is where you have these big arrays and the utility owns the operation and sells it back to customers. Again, that resource is mostly in the Southwest. And then you can take wind, which is the most rapidly growing renewable power generator in the U.S. and the world. And you see it could add a lot, but it doesn't really amount to much in the Southeast. We've got the Buffalo Mountain site here up the TVA runs in Tennessee, but there's just a little bit of it up in Georgia here in some of the areas that people say are not likely to be developed for wind. This map doesn't show the offshore resource, and the National Renewable Energy Lab is reanalyzing how much wind is available, for instance, on the continental shelf off the Georgia coast. That has really never been sufficiently studied and probably requires some investment to do it right. So that is an unknown. Now we turn to biomass and biofuels. So biomass for power generation and biofuels for transportation. Here, the Southeast does very well, including the state of Georgia. So that is the resource, along with, I think, landfill gas, that would do very well in Georgia. So when you add geothermal, and you get, now energy efficiency is added to this pyramid. And again, you can see lots of opportunities for industrial, manufacturing efficiency improvements and building efficiency improvements. So renewable portfolio standards are probably in their traditional configuration, not what Georgia needs. Maybe something like a clean energy standard where you bundle and you say that a certain amount of efficiency, a certain amount of energy use should be met through efficiency and some combination of renewables where you can allow bioenergy to play. So my last slide here reminds us that we are sliding backward in terms of most metrics of the energy sustainability of our energy system in the U.S. The Southeast is ripe for a push toward clean energy and energy efficiency, and just wanted to remind you that the future is inherently open, options are numerous, and the choice is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for that presentation. Any questions from the committee? I've got one quick question, if you will, on some of your talk about energy. I think I noticed it on your slide. I don't think I remember you mentioning too much about it, but about nuclear energy in conjunction with the renewables and the conservation. Would you just elaborate on that just briefly, where that may fit into the picture?
Yeah, I didn't really talk to that. Of course, in terms of greenhouse gas free power, nuclear is an important option. And I understand that Georgia Power is a Southern company are considering some investment in that area, and I know that that's true around the country. It's especially true in the Southeast. Obviously, there are problems with not having a permanent waste repository in the country, and I worry that investors will not cough up the kind of required resources without a repository in place. And so the federal government's got to fix that problem. But they're talking about some more distributed, temporary waste storage and other options that might meet the needs. So yeah, nuclear, it's a good way to consider going.
Well, let me ask you this, and if you're not prepared to answer this like you would like to, that's certainly fine. Maybe we can get together at some point later, but I know there's one or two other questions from committee members here, but as far as incentivizing putting nuclear generation reactors and new plants in place, any thoughts on what the state of Georgia could do to incentivize building more nuclear generating capacity?
I think the production tax credits concept could fit both nuclear and other clean power options. That would be something to consider. I know the Energy Policy Act of 2005 had a lot of different incentives for nuclear investments, different types of insurance and underwriting, but hasn't yet pushed that first permit request out there.
Thank you. Representative Amerson? Anyone? Thank you. I appreciate that. Look forward to your book coming out in February.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, next, Gilda Garton. Am I pronouncing that correctly? If you would make your way down.
It is. Did you find it? Is this it? Yeah. Wonderful. There you go, man. Okay. Make sure we got this. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to come down. Andrew let me know that you wanted to hear a little bit about how Georgia Tech goes about commercializing its intellectual property, as well as some of the guidelines and regulations that we follow in that process. So I'm going to go walk through a little bit of the process of commercialization of intellectual property, and then, of course, take any questions that you might have. I think most of you are pretty familiar with the range of research that goes on at Georgia Tech. We do research in a wide variety of fields. This slide happens to show some of our interdisciplinary fields that give rise to an awful lot of the intellectual property that we have in our portfolio, particularly nanomedicine. And I know that you had Gang Bao here earlier today, and we've done a lot in microelectronics, and I know Mark Prausnitz has talked with you. So you're seeing a little bit of both sides, the administration as well as the really exciting researcher stuff. Unfortunately, the part I get to do isn't nearly as much fun as the part that Gang Bao and Mark and Randy Gunsler and others who are talking with you today get to do. We just get to do the paperwork. Okay. Technology transfer at Georgia Tech actually takes a number of forms. The first and most important form of technology transfer is still the peer review publication. The vast majority of our research ends up in publications. The equally important form of technology transfer at Georgia Tech, as all research universities, is education of students. The information, the knowledge that the students take out of the door to their future employers is one of the, basic fundamental mechanisms for technology transfer. We also, of course, work with the industry through our continuing education programs. Our faculty do consulting engagements with industry. And sort of last on the list, but probably the most exciting from the topic you're considering today, is licensing, both licensing to existing companies and then licensing to form new companies here in Georgia, the startup companies. So why do we do tech transfer? Well, the most important reason that Georgia Tech or any research university engages in technology transfer as an organized activity, the reason we have offices dedicated to technology transfer, is to ensure that the public benefits from the research activities at the institution. Doesn't do any good if our faculty do all this research and nobody can ever use it for anything. So we do it to ensure public benefit to the research, from the research. The other reason we do technology transfer is because our faculty members and our students like to work on problems that are real and relevant to people's lives. So it provides a great deal of satisfaction to the inventors to see their technology brought into practical application. It also meets Georgia Tech's obligations to our sponsors. We are required under law to take effective steps to transfer intellectual property that arises in the course of our federally funded research. Researchers are required as a condition of their employment, and this gets at one of the things Andrew wanted me to cover, and that's ownership of intellectual property. Researchers are required, as a matter of their employment, to assign their inventions to the university for which they work. So Georgia Tech's inventors assign their intellectual property to Georgia Tech. The revenue that is generated by any eventual license of intellectual property must be used for research and education. We do share royalties with inventors. All of this is covered in a body of law and regulation that comes to us mostly from our federal funding agencies. This is probably a familiar slide to those of you who come to very many briefings at Georgia Tech, and that is how much research we do every year. This slide happens to show research awards. Our total research expenditures are around $450 million. The research awards that come through my office top around $350 million. Last year we had 365 invention disclosures. We all remember that because that means we were doing an invention disclosure a day every day of the year, which makes for a pretty busy office. The bulk of our research funding comes from federal agencies, although as universities go, Georgia Tech has a high percentage of our research funding from private industry. Somewhere around 20% of our research every year is funded by private industry in one form or another. And Georgia Tech ranked in the top 10 last year in the number of patents issued to U.S. universities. We had about 43 issued patents. So of that 365 invention disclosures, about 10% will wind up as patents and eventually be issued patents. So where do we get the rules for intellectual property ownership? And I promise you there's only one slide that lists rules. We get them from the Board of Regents. It's part of the Board of Regents actually has policies on ownership of intellectual property, and Georgia Tech's and all the university system of Georgia are pretty much consistent. You may also hear what's referred to as the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act is an important piece of legislation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. It's a federal law. The other source of regulation comes to us from the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. The government really does attach a few strings, although not many, to the intellectual property that's generated in the course of Georgia Tech or any other research university's research. And of course, the circulars that govern how we handle the money also tell us a little bit about what to do with the intellectual property, and those are the Office of Management and Budget circulars. And the ever-popular taxman does weigh in and add a few more strings to how we do our business. Okay, Bayh-Dole Act. Bayh-Dole Act was passed about 26 years ago. It was passed in December of 1980. And it was Senator Bob Dole and Birch Bayh who got together and got the act through Congress. The reason that they felt like it was important to pass this law was that at the time, there were emerging economies in Asia were outcompeting the United States in innovation every which way from Sunday. And so they were looking around and saying that the federal government is investing billions of dollars in research, and not very much of it is becoming new products, goods, and services in the United States. What are we going to do about that? They looked at it and they found out that at the time the federal government was taking title to inventions that came out of university research. And they said, well, gee, let's give those inventions to somebody that might do something with them. Let's let the universities keep them. So the Bayh-Dole Act was passed, and that allows universities to elect title to inventions that come out of research conducted at the university. Gives us a couple of strings. One, we must take steps, effective steps, to commercialize that intellectual property or otherwise bring it into use. We have to make sure that it is reasonably available to all the citizens. We have to take steps to alleviate health and safety concerns, and we have to share royalties with our inventors. That was an important law. That tells you that the industry for technology transfer from universities is about 26 years old. Prior to that, universities couldn't take title to their inventions in most cases, so we've only been doing it for about 25 years. So what are our obligations? Well, we have to pay attention to our faculty members. We do pay royalty streams to those faculty members, and we have to have reasonable strategies when we enter into a license agreement with a company to make sure that that company is successful and that we are eventually able to exit from the relationship. We also have to be true to our nonprofit roots, and we have to use the proceeds of our intellectual property transfer for research and education, and we are otherwise passive shareholders if we have an equity stake in a company that's created based on our technologies. And of course, we have to manage our conflicts of interest and have arm's length relationships with those people that we're transferring the technology to. So people ask us from time to time, how much money are you going to make on this? And a couple of people have done a little bit of analysis. I'll give Lou Berneman from University of Pennsylvania credit for developing this slide originally, or at least this analysis, that shows really the process of intellectual property transfer. The research leads to invention disclosures or technology disclosures that have to be assessed. Some great things, some new and novel inventions are just really, really cool, but nobody wants them. They're just not good for much in the marketplace. And so you have to do a little bit of assessment of the opportunity. And often there's an awful lot of prior art out there, or there are perfectly adequate solutions in place, and so there's not much opportunity for this new technology. If the technology is new and novel and worth being protected, then that patent prosecution has to take place, and somebody has to come up with a commercialization strategy. Those things that are new products, new services, those things are typically licensed to existing companies. Technologies that have the potential to change an industry, a way an industry does business, the way a disease is treated, or that form the platform for an entirely new industry, those are the kinds of technologies that typically do well in startup companies. And so we try to triage opportunities into those two very big buckets. And then we write agreements with our licensees or an agreement with the startup company, and hopefully we'll get a license in place. Okay. Nationwide, these are national statistics. At the time this slide was prepared, the federal government was putting something around $200 billion of research into $200 billion into research at U.S. universities. There was about one invention disclosure for every $2 million. You might remember that Georgia Tech's rate is slightly higher than that. We're kind of proud of that. We think our investigators are just particularly creative. They come up with a lot of new ideas. But nationwide, you get about one invention for every $2 million in research. Of that, about half of those will proceed to the patent application stage, and about 25% will make it to a license stage. Of that, less than 1% will ever earn more than $125,000, and about 2.5% will ever be a successful startup company that is liquidated, so that you can see the attrition along the way. The chances of any single invention becoming a successful company are relatively low, which speaks very well for some of the investigators that we've got out there with companies that are doing quite well. Georgia Tech has around 80 existing startup companies. This is the organization that is in place at Georgia Tech to administer research and intellectual property. I am not going to go through this with you, but I thought I would make it available to you if any of you are interested in having the names and offices that handle this stuff. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about the technology transfer machine at Georgia Tech, because there are several organizations involved in it. The Office of Technology Licensing, which is part of the Georgia Tech Research Corporation, is the office that's responsible for patent protection and license drafting. This is the organization that will actually enter into a license agreement. It is GTRC, Georgia Tech Research Corporation, that owns the intellectual property that results from research at Georgia Tech. Commercialization Services is a unit within the Economic Innovation Institute, headed up by Wayne Hodges, that works with new ventures that are forming around intellectual property that comes out of Georgia Tech, or even other new ventures that form in the local environment. They help these companies develop their business plans and marketing strategies and that sort of thing. Commercialization Services also helps in marketing licenses to existing companies, so some of the other traditional licensing activities they'll become engaged in. ATDC, the Advanced Technology Development Center, is our business incubator, and I'm sure everybody here has probably had the opportunity to visit with ATDC at some point in the past. These three offices work together as part of that machine that takes the invention disclosure and gets it out into the marketplace and assists those companies in getting off the ground. This is another slide that I will not go through with you in detail. We only have 10 minutes or so this morning or this afternoon. But this tells you who is responsible for which part of the activity, through whether it's the licensing activity or the support of the new venture or the startup company. Commercialization Services and the Office of Technology Licensing work in parallel to support these new ventures as they're created. How have we been doing? We had about 365 invention disclosures last year. We had 38 patents issued, 40 patents licensed, and we formed 10 new startup companies in 2006. So we're very optimistic about those companies. They all seem to be doing pretty well at this point. And with that, I'll turn it to questions, because I know that there are probably a lot more questions that came out of this morning's presentations than I've addressed here.
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Gardner. Any questions from the committee? No questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We certainly do
Thank you.
appreciate that. Next up on the agenda is Suzanne Sitherwood with Atlanta Gas Light. And let me express my appreciation to all those faculty, professors here at Georgia Tech for the presentations they made regarding different aspects of energy and technology that the campus is working on here, that Georgia Tech is working on. We really appreciate that. If you notice the agenda, what we're doing now, we're switching gears. We're hearing from several private companies as they address the Business Incentive Study Committee. And of course, first up is Suzanne Sitherwood, Atlanta Gas Light. Suzanne, thank you for being here. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Chairman and committee members, for the invitation. First of all, it's great to be here on this tech campus. For you that know me, we are a tech family. In fact, my son is currently here, and every time I ask him what year he's in, he always says, "Oh, I'm in the 5th year." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting. When I was here, you either said sophomore or senior or something like that, but I get the response the 5th year." So it's nice to be here. And I had a great driver that brought me over, a great chaperone, and he's a UGA grad, and so I told him to turn on First Street, and he missed the turn, and I said, "Why didn't you turn?" And he said, "Well, UGA grads, we spell it F-I-R-S-T. So I did make it, and so fortunately you were running a little bit behind, because we were running a little bit behind, but I'm sure that you guys have enjoyed a very interesting morning and have learned a lot. The agenda looked really good, really powerful on a lot of different subject matters, so I was sorry that I couldn't make it. I had other obligations. I've been with the company for 25 years and have thoroughly enjoyed it. The energy industry has changed remarkably over the decades, and the subjects that you are addressing this morning are significant today. Alternative energy sources are on the forefront of our thoughts, and we as a nation and a state certainly need to be creative, committed, and convinced for these quests for alternative sources. Today, these sources make up, whether it be biomass, ethanol, wind, whatever, make up about 6% of the energy sources today that we are using. But the reality is, the realism is, and us being in the gas industry, that really will not fulfill our growth needs for the coming years. And so we at Atlanta Gas Light Company and we in the natural gas industry are fully committed to certainly supporting these alternatives, but at the same time continuing to stay the course on understanding what the needs are and in our industry as well. Because consumption does remain very, very strong. We all pretty much take at times energy for granted. Like I said, I've been with the company for 25 years, and we sort of wake up and the heat's there and the water heating's there, and quite frankly, it's a beautiful thing. Those individuals with the electric providers and us with the gas company, we work very hard to provide those levels of services, and that is what we want. But there are a lot of complications that come along with that. And I'll just give you one sort of simple anecdotal piece. Yesterday, for example, we had 4,000 customers or premises that called us and said, it's getting cold. We need gas. So, I circle the wagons and we take all of our field forces and, we go out there and we turn on 4,000 meters and the gas shows up. But obviously, there's a whole lot that goes into the planning and the bringing of that gas to market. And we don't want our customers to have to worry about that necessarily, but we as an industry and as state policymakers do have to think about those kinds of things. And demand is growing. We are truly blessed to be in the South. It is growing strong. We grow about 1.3% per year, which means by the time we'll grow 30% in essence over the next 25 years. The nation is growing at 25% in terms of its growth rate. And us that are in the energy business, we think about what does that mean in terms of providing for infrastructure and the supply. In the natural gas industry today, 25% of the gas that is consumed for power generation. When I was a wee babe in the industry, about 0% was used for power generation. About 10 years ago, about 2% was used for power generation. About 30% of the volume that is burned today or consumed is consumed for the industrial customer base. And our manufacturing base is very important to us as an economy, both at the state and in this nation. Another 25% of the gas that's consumed is for residential use. All of us that live in our homes, and hopefully every one of you in this room use natural gas in your homes. Another 10% is for our commercial customers, and then sort of the residual of that is used to operate the system and some other things. But that growth trajectory that I've told you about in terms of increased consumption is primarily driven by power generation. And the need to grow into the generators that have been placed on the system, number one, and then number two, because we are in a growth market here in the South, especially, that we will have to bring new generation online to meet those demands. And natural gas is one of the energy sources used in that process, so therefore some of that power generation certainly will be for natural gas. We as a company do support economic development. I mean, I've had some people talk to me about, they say, well, what if we have a no-growth strategy in the state? We support economic development because we believe, the tide rises for all. And Atlanta Gas Light Company, from an economic development perspective, bringing in industry, we don't make any money off the industrial customers that we serve. This deregulation model is such that does not happen for us as a utility. But we work very aggressively with the commissioner here in the state, with other utilities, to bring industry into Georgia. We invest in Georgia Allies. We have, in fact, the ex-commissioner of economic development, Randy Cardoza, is on our staff, and we encourage greatly industry into our state. And this deregulation model, the way it works is Georgia has the lowest transportation cost than any of the surrounding states. So it's a benefit that we bring to Georgia around economic development. And when those industries come here, of course, they demand energy. And from an industry perspective, some of the largest manufacturers, about 13% of their cost, their operating cost, is energy consumption. So we as energy planners are very cognizant of what that means in terms of their cost to do business in Georgia. The price of the commodity is another consideration. And the price of the commodity is driven to a large degree by supply and demand. And for nationally, when you look at the amount of gas that is consumed by these different groups, be it power generation or residential, commercial, industrial, it's about 23 trillion cubic feet of gas a year. That's a lot of gas. And in terms of the supply that's available domestically, there's about 20 cubic feet of supply available. So you can see that the lines are not where they need to be. And as a result of that, if you have extremely cold weather or extremely hot weather in the summer for power generation, the supply and demand curve creates volatility in the price, and it also creates a higher absolute price. And we saw this exacerbated during the Katrina-Rita outages when the production areas went down. We lost about 70% of the production area, and the prices jumped immediately from $5 up to about $17 on a unit basis. So it exacerbated sort of that current condition and issue that we are dealing with, which is how do we get more available supply to our consumers, and especially the consumers in Georgia. So, Chairman and other members, I think your timing is great. It is right for good long-term state policy and good regulatory construct. Because I do believe the only way really to give consumers confidence that the price will stay relatively low and take the volatility out of the market is by introducing new supply sources into Georgia. Currently, the state of Georgia gets 90% of its gas out of the Gulf of Mexico. And generally, we get that gas out of one pipeline. And so we don't really have a variety of supply sources, and we don't really have a variety of transportation sources. And there are other sources available in the Appalachia area. There's certainly gas. There's gas off our coast in Elba Island in a liquefied natural gas form. So there are other supply sources available. We've just got to be innovative and creative in figuring out how to get those supplies to market. And part of the way of doing that is getting more flexibility around the regulatory rules that we operate our utility under, and do that in a way that creates innovation. In order for Atlanta Gas Light Company to go out and invest in infrastructure, we do need to go to the commission and serve up those creative ideas, and at the same time, if we serve up those creative ideas and they believe that that's good for Georgia, then we need to get recovery of that infrastructure. Currently, the model is not built to allow us to do that. The other sort of piece of the puzzle that is sort of missing in the current policy and the current regulatory construct is giving us the ability to look more on a long-term basis and not a short line of sight, because a lot of this infrastructure that we're talking about, either supply or building infrastructure, have long lead times, And if we're managing, that look on a quarter-by-quarter basis, then it doesn't give us the line of sight to build and be prepared for when that growth does come to Georgia. The sort of the interesting point on that, and you say, well, if that's true, well, why hasn't that been done? And the reality is, again, it's sort of the regulatory construct and policy. And I'll give you an example. Atlanta Gas Light Company hasn't built any capacity-like infrastructure or storage facilities in over 30 years. We're operating our system based on the facilities that we put in place that look more capacity-like that were built 30 to 50 years ago. And we do build infrastructure to these new subdivisions and to these new commercial developments. And we do move our facilities when road widening and those sorts of things. But that infrastructure that we put in place 30 years ago has served Georgia very, very well. But because of all the growth that we've had, it's now time to rethink and rebuild additional infrastructure to make sure that Georgians have a reliable gas service. With the supply outlook and the lack of infrastructure to get gas from the Gulf of Mexico and other supply sources into Georgia, and because of power generation, and because of the growth in the state, our industry has gotten more complicated with time. And when I first started at Atlanta Gas Light Company, it was pretty simple. We didn't have technology. The pockets that we served were a lot simpler in terms of their construction. But it's much more complicated today. And with complication drives the need for creativity and innovation. And now is the time for the state and the energy companies to start thinking about what are some of those innovative solutions that we can put forward to make sure that we are growing the state properly into the future. And again, with power generation taking up much of the future natural gas demand, we really have to think about bringing new sources of energy to this state, new sources of natural gas energy to this state. Last winter taught us a valuable lesson. The lines were coming together anyway in terms of supply and demand, and the hurricanes just brought them there a lot quicker. We appreciate the policymakers very much for studying these complicated issues. We know that there's no easy answer, and you are obviously listening to a lot of alternative solutions as well as looking at the natural gas industry and the electric industry. And we appreciate your time immensely. We do believe that sort of these proactive actions, we will work through it and solve this for Georgians for years to come. So I appreciate your time. I apologize I don't have all the PowerPoints, but appreciate your time and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that. Any questions? Committee members? Go ahead.
If I could. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an earlier presentation, I don't recall if you were here for the part of it, one of the slides talked about the reduction, and I think they were talking about same dollars in expenditures or capital investment by electric companies, going from 2 to 5, or I'm sorry, from 5 to 2 in billions, from $5 billion to $2 billion in terms of using $2003 from 1970 to 2004. So basically, the electric infrastructure in the country is investing 40% 34 years later in the same dollars. I think what I heard you say, similar things with your company, ability to deliver. You're not talking about building into the new subdivision, but building the big infrastructure. And I know Chairman Lewis, probably won't bring it up, but I will. I mean, we were trying to make that easier last year, and it got all muddled with, as if we were trying to take away the PSC's regulatory authority, which the bill did not do. Some people flew in at the last minute and talked to the Senate committee and really confused the issue with nothing that worked in the real world. Comment to the level that you can on what position this state and this area in the southeast would be in if we found ourselves in a Katrina Rita type situation, prolonged for some reason, weather, disruption in supply because of a threat of some sort, I mean, can you elaborate
Sure.
on it? You mentioned that we have the one line coming up, of course, have Elba Island, but I just know that everybody, when they turn the lights on, when they turn the heater on, they expect it to be
Sure.
there. Can you give us a brief
Sure, be glad to.
medium case scenario of that?
Sure. And I'll start with a bit of a segue. The characterization that you started with is correct. When a lot of this infrastructure on an interstate pipeline basis or for Atlanta Gas Light Company system, including our liquefied natural gas peaking facilities in our system, we built this 30 to say 50 years ago. And when you build this type infrastructure, you build it bigger and you grow into it because they're very large construction projects and you build them to grow into. Well, we've gotten to the point as an energy industry that we've grown into all that infrastructure, and especially in the South because of the growth market. And I say that to lead into the response to your question. When all this infrastructure was built from the Gulf of Mexico and we built our infrastructure to connect to that, because we are using it at, quote, peak capacity now, to the extent that there are weather conditions or Katrinas, or when I say weather conditions, extremely cold weather, it taxes the system differently than it did 10 years ago. And because we've grown into all this infrastructure, we that have responsibility, be it policymakers or the utilities, we have the responsibility to understand that growth and understand the sourcing infrastructure that's needed and the transportation or transmission infrastructure that's needed. To the extent that we can diversify the sources and diversify either the transmission or transportation into Georgia, then we're mitigating risk for future Georgians. Again, today, having one straw out of the Gulf of Mexico into Metro Atlanta with one pool of source, if you will, it's sort of putting all your eggs in one basket. And it worked when you weren't operating everything to full capacity. It still works today, but your risks are higher.
To follow up and to tie that into the Business Incentive Study Committee, the people most at risk in a situation where you run out capacity are your interruptible customers, right? Industry. So, I mean, that's, Mr. Chairman, what I wanted to bring up. I mean, you could interrupt those customers and more than likely you would be able to continue heating the residential homes in the area. More than likely you would be able to do that. But what we are at risk of is our future business growth in the state, are we not? And I guess I'm getting toward, we're looking for business incentive opportunities. We have the opportunity to let you guys provide that for us as a state and for our business community if we can work to
that is correct.
Ease those regulations.
Yeah. Mostly the infrastructure is built for residential and firm service customers, residential and small business customers, and it's called firm, that gets there every day regardless, even though now the system is somewhat taxed. And we do interrupt our large manufacturing or interruptible customers on those coldest days of the year. But it is not our desire to make that a pattern over time and burden our industrial customers, because that is not good for economic development. It's not good for their manufacturing process. It creates additional cost because they do have alternative sources, but it creates additional cost for those manufacturers. So it is a good construct for us to be able to interrupt them to make sure that service is on, but it's not a good way to operate your business through the winter.
Is that it for now? I got a few questions, if you don't mind. If I just quickly noted down the numbers you mentioned of how much of the gas goes to industrial, commercial, power generation, and consumers. And between industrial, commercial, and power generation, I came up with roughly 65%, which I would imagine leaves the other 35% for consumers and to run your system, as I think you mentioned. Bearing that in mind, is it your opinion that when you add up our interstate and intrastate pipeline capacity, is that enough for today and for the next 20 years?
And the current infrastructure is at full capacity. If I go to a pipeline and ask them for additional capacity, they don't have it to say, here, yes, go, I will give it to you. They have to actually go construct and invest capital in their infrastructure to be able to deliver that capacity. If I asked them 10 years ago, the capacity was there and they would make it available, which I guess getting back to the question of last year's proposal, the proposal to build some infrastructure from Elba Island into Atlanta